Hello friends, this is Otz, and in today's video we will talk about every single killer in the game, from the very first, the Trapper, until the very latest one, the Houndmaster. We will be ranking all of them on a tier list and speaking about what makes each of them a little bit good, a little bit bad, a little bit unique, and anything in between that I can think of. And before I do that, let me just share with you the criteria of the tier list. If you read this, we will be on the same page. Other than that, feel free to just disagree on everything. You can pause the video right now. This is the full tier list, and just write your angry comments saying that I'm wrong. It's just a tradition at this point. Anyway, time to start with the S tier killers. The S tier killers are killers that almost break the fabric of the game, and none of them are better at exemplifying that than the Nurse. The Nurse has almost always been on the #1 spot in the game. The main reason why is because her power allows her to skip and outplay most of the chase mechanics that other killers have to abide by. She doesn't really mind pallets. She can teleport over them and doesn't need to break them. Windows and verticality and hills, other things that keep other killers a little bit delayed, actually work in her favor. If you vault a window, it's actually very easy for her to hit you. If you drop or are on top of a hill, that can actually be a really bad spot to be against a Nurse. And even though she has her own counterplay, her own unique way to play against her that is in its own right quite fun and engaging, it is mostly tilted towards her favor. Yes, you can try to remove line of sight and get behind cover and use stealth perks and try to be sneaky, and all of these things work pretty well until you go against a good Nurse and then you realize why she's #1. The one thing you need to understand is that since the last patch, Nurse has only gotten more and more decent. If you want to go for a Scorchhawk build with Floods of Rage, which is one of her best perks, you now have a new perk from the Houndmaster to make Scorchhawk Floods of Rage even more consistent. Nowhere to Hide still works beautifully. Barbecue still works beautifully. Lethal Pursuer still works beautifully. All of these auto-reading perks are still really good, and because Distortion got nerfed, you can now expect to find survivors a lot more frequently as well. The slowdown perks, almost all of them work very nicely on her as well. And one thing that you need to keep in mind is that even though the Nurse does not have the same level of incredibly quick mobility as the next couple killers do, she is incredibly good once she's caught you up at denying any kind of fence, wall, main building, elevation, anything like that. So even though she doesn't have the same raw mobility, in many ways it is a superior type. Now, one of the major downsides of playing Nurse is that some maps can be a little bit tricky. Say you play on Larry's, the hospital map, and every survivor is going room to room. It can be quite difficult to ever get a nice line of sight, and you would have to do a lot of guessing. But here is where some of her builds come into play. If you have a build that has some perk like Corrupt Intervention, that works beautifully in big outdoor maps, but also works beautifully in indoor maps where survivors will have a much harder time at the start. She also uses auto perks really well in these maps, and instead of having to guess, you honestly become a killer with very little counter. Survivors have to play you well in the 1v1, or they risk going down too quickly and triggering your slowdown perks, and they also have to beat you a little bit in the 4v1. They have to play as a team because it's very easy for survivors to misplay, find themselves on the ground, or find themselves in a situation where no one can heal, no one can go for the rescue, someone hits stage 2, and things snowball from there. So she tests survivors in many different ways, and her skill ceiling allows her to be played by people that are really good. That being said, from my experience, I do notice that the Nurse is not incredibly popular nowadays. So maybe there's something about her that is not as fun. Maybe people have already run their course with Nurse. You let me know if you see her very often. Next up, we have the Blight. The Blight is arguably the second S tier character that also breaks the conventional rules of the game. Now, this killer doesn't break them as overtly as Nurse. He does have to break pallets sometimes. He will find himself having to play around windows sometimes. But the thing is, this killer almost never has a struggle catching up. He has downs, pretty much downright the best mobility in the game. It's on command, it leads to hits, it leads to pallet breaks. He does not have the assortment of insane add-ons that he used to have, but it doesn't matter. His add-ons are still fairly serviceable, and his base kit remains almost as good as ever. The fact that we have a variety of builds right now that really go well on him. All of the slowdown builds work on him pretty well. The Hex builds are really mean on him because of his mobility. You can quite literally get a down and check on your totems before a survivor can get through your first layer of undying, thrill the hunt, etc, etc. This is a killer that if you become really good at him, he leaves very little room for survivors to make mistakes. He does not have such an easy way as Nurse at dealing with body blocks. Let's say that you're trying to force a weak link out and you're chasing them and they're dead on hook. You cannot go through other survivors like Nurse can, but let's be real, you can hit them and recover so quickly, and you can sometimes outspeed them so dramatically that, yeah, it probably warrants him being number spot. An argument could be made that he could be at the bottom of the next tier, but that might just come down to just, you know, personal preference. Honestly, he does seem like, when played by a very strong player, Blight still belongs here. Now we are going down a slight tier to the A+ tier. Now this is a little bit different from what it looked last time. Keep in mind, Billy used to be one of the best killers in the game for a long time. Then we had the complete change of his power that made him overhit, and then he was an incredibly below average or average killer and was very difficult to play. Then you might remember that he got reworked again, and he had the overdrive, the blue chainsaw system. That's pretty much where we made the last tier list, and he was really strong. And then they buffed him a couple more times, like in a way that was honestly really hard to comprehend. At his strongest, I would argue Billy would belong up there in the S tier, and honestly some people still think he does, with Nurse and Blight. But now he's received a couple little nerfs that have made him a little bit less oppressive. A more reasonable cooldown after missing a chainsaw, some nerfs to some add-ons here and there, and the maximum speed that he had in overdrive. His overdrive now dissipates a little bit faster. One of his most disgusting add-ons, the low pro chains, no longer down survivors. If they drop a pallet, they will either take damage or take mending. They will not go down. And when you combine all of these little nerfs to the fact that he does have a little bit of a difficult time in some indoor maps, in some maps with tough combinations of like a strong window next to another strong window, this killer does struggle a little bit more. He is the first killer that often needs, like, he has to dedicate, it often feels like he has to dedicate one perk slot to dealing with windows, such as Bamboozle or something similar. You can have success without it, but the fact that you need that for your power to sometimes shine and that you're a bit more map dependent, I think places him on a slightly different league than the two killers above. That being said, Billy is incredibly powerful. Playing against strong Billys, you feel an incredible presence and pressure. They are able to turn games on a dime. If anyone is on the hook, someone else goes down, you're now in a situation where even two survivors need to be extremely careful because of his mobility, insta-down, and frankly, just ridiculous ability to close the gap even on relatively large maps. Now, a more interesting new addition to the tier list that has a lot of different aspects to him is Dracula. Unlike Billy, he's not defined by just one big insta-down power or one mobility. He's a lot more, he's definitely the most complex killer out of the ones that we talked so far. Dracula basically has 3 powers and combines some of the best abilities of other killers that are close to him on the tier list. First of all, the bat form is an incredible way to get around the map, gather information, and close the gap to survivors. If you have a map that doesn't have a lot of safety, other killers can still struggle. Sometimes with one of the lower tier killers, you can chase behind a survivor and chase and catch up, and then they have some kind of endurance or something, and then you hit them and then catch up, then someone body blocks and you spend half the game chasing after people. That will never happen with Dracula. He can switch to bat form and catch up to any survivor, avoid body blocks, mine gaps, teleport to drop pallets or windows. All of this gives him a little bit of an edge on main building maps and almost puts him on a similar level with Nurse in terms of how his mobility works. He's not able to teleport from one point of the map to another, like some of the other killers we will see, and he's not as immediately fast on command as Bailey or Blight, but he's pretty damn close, and that's just the bad form. That's just the bad form. Now let's talk about the other forms. His wolf form is honestly a much easier to use Wesker that has a lot of strength, has the ability to break pallets, although not very quickly, and get some really, really nasty hits, as well as some tricks on elevation as well. The wolf is a very, very decent chasing form. It's now been made stronger. If you were playing Dracula on release, you might remember the wolf being a little bit bad on the PTB. It wasn't very fast, and then on release it was okay, but now it's been buffed and it's on a really, really, really good spot. The wolf also makes survivors drop centaurs, which gives him a little bit of passive reconnaissance / information gathering. He's able to find survivors sometimes at the start of the map by just seeing white orbs appear from behind rocks and so on. So that's pretty nice. And perhaps the most complex ability of Dracula is the one that comes in his vampire default form, which is the Hellfire. The Hellfire is basically a miniaturized version of the Punishment of the Damned from Pyramid Head. It's a little small column of fire pillars that goes in front of you. And it has a lot of interesting properties to it. Number one, it can hit multiple survivors. This means that you can get multiple downs, that you can deny protection hits, which is a big deal because survivors often want to protect each other when one of them is about to be taken out. So against this killer, it is very, very hard for multiple reasons. It can also allow you to play extremely dirty around unhooks. If a survivor unhooks someone else in front of you, you're not going to choose A or B. You're going to have both of them. You're going to hit both of them. And there's very little counterplay to this. And another thing that's interesting about the Hellfire pillars is that they can go over obstacles. The general idea of these pillars is that if any obstacle is below your eye level, they can go over it. But they can also go through gaps, and it's a little bit more complex than that. So basically, if you do a little bit of your own research and your own practice, you will find that this killer can hit you on a variety of places that sometimes are not even intuitive. So yeah, all of these tools in the hands of an average player can make this killer pretty fearsome. If this is given to someone that is really, really decent, it's honestly quite stacked against the survivors. And I don't know if we have achieved that yet, but if we ever have a Dracula main that only plays Dracula and specializes in all of this, you have a recipe for disaster. This killer is honestly disgusting. He has so much going. If you're always using the right tool for the right situation, survivors should go down in seconds. Their only hope maybe is to bring you to maps that are very, very difficult, use stealth very, very effectively, and use their best exhaustion perks to create so much distance that your attacking forms don't really get a lot of momentum. That would be their best hope. Once you catch up to them, you can do so many fake outs with the fire pillar. Sometimes survivors will literally dodge out of the way and you can cancel and just M1 them. And then once they make distance, you turn into a bat and you catch up to them. And yeah. The wolf also, by the way, I neglected to mention, has the advantages of giving you a third-person view, which can be good on some loops, and also making you relatively quiet. So there are some mind games that you can do with wolf form as well. Yeah, overall, a disgusting killer that requires a lot of skill to pull off, but once you play this right, you have a killer that can do basically everything. Next up, we have the twins. Now, some people think the twins are actually a pretty bad killer, maybe based on their previous reputation. Some time ago, the twins were a lot lower than this because despite being relatively strong and being one of the most deadly killers in tournaments and high-level play, the twins had a lot of bugs and a lot of quality of life issues, and honestly, it made them so inconsistent that it was hard to enjoy them. They were also very, very add-on dependent. Then, for a brief time, the developers mega buffed the twins. The twins became the best killer in the game for a very, very brief period of time, probably ahead of Nurse. There was a PTB where the twins were able to injure survivors without Victor being attached to them. So Victor could just pounce on a survivor twice super quickly and survivors couldn't kick him. It was honestly disgusting. It was super, super strong. They, unfortunately, for twins mains, walk back from this update, and the twins went back to being a more restrained killer with some weaknesses, but they kept most of the quality of lives, and a few changes to make them less add-on dependent were built into their base kit. So what you have with Victor and Charlotte, the twins, is a very, very simple combo. With Charlotte, you have a normal killer that does normal things, can move at 115, break pallets, hit you through windows, blah, blah, blah. And with Victor, you have a radar that can be placed around the map to detect survivors, and an incredibly potent chasing tool that is largely unavoidable. With Victor, you chase a survivor, you move very, very, very fast by default. You do a little pounce, and bam, you either down them or you attach to them. Now, when you attach to them, the survivors do not necessarily want to get rid of Victor right away. If they do that, they kind of give you Victor back. So what many survivors will do is they'll start walking around the map and taking Victor far away. You will only be able to get, if they do this, you will only be able to get Victor back every 30 seconds. So your job as the twins is basically to make sure that everyone is injured. That's why some perks like Force Penance can be popular in them. And once everyone is injured, then the problems begin for the survivors, because Victor is going to go get it down, get it down, get it down, stay on a down survivor. Someone else comes for the rescue, hit them. Now you show up. Maybe you have one of the iridescent add-ons that's making you stealthy on Charlotte, and everything goes down. The nature of Victor being so unavoidable is what makes twins really, really, really powerful. If you have enough survivors injured, or if you have enough slowdown, even if they hold Victor hostage for 30 seconds, you basically have a killer that every 30 or so seconds is threatening to down you. So if a team is not consistently able to heal faster than this, or somehow protect each other faster than this, they will eventually find themselves really, really struggling. They are also incredibly good at defending an area for obvious reasons. They can be in two places at once. And keep in mind that there are some perks that can hurt the twins, but they are not the most common. And also, not every team is capable of pulling them off. If the team that you're going against as a twin is a bit experienced, one thing that they can do is kind of group up in pairs. And if they group up in pairs, they can have one survivor tank the hit, go down, then the other survivor waits a little bit, then kicks Victor, then picks up the other survivor. And if they have certain anti-slugging perks, the twins can actually suffer quite a bit. Most of the maps and most of the horrible situations that the twins used to be really bad in are now a little bit better. There's not as many huge maps. Some of the passive perks that twins really love to use are now much better. Since the twins has to spend so much time leaving people on the ground and can't always hook really quickly, they don't necessarily use perks like Pain Res or Pop Goes the Weasel as nicely as other killers, but we now have amazing alternatives for that. We have Wretched Fate, we have Hex builds, which are really powerful at the moment. We have things like Deadman Switch, which has been buffed. We had things like Deadlock, which has been nerfed, but is still pretty good. All of those things work really well on twins. Honestly, if you doubt their position on the tier list, I urge you to watch some good twins players, or even play them yourself. The twins, compared to the other killers that we talked about, are much easier to play. They do require a bit of a tactical mind, but they are much easier to play than any of the other killers that we're going to talk about before or for a little while. So you could play as them, and you will probably find a lot of success. Next up is Hux, aka Larry, aka Singularity. That's where Larry comes from. Singularity is a disgusting monster. He is a horribly difficult to play against killer nowadays. Now, if you watch a previous tier list or someone else's tier list some months ago, this killer was nowhere near as high. He was nowhere near the top 5 for a good reason. He did not have the quality of life changes that he does have right now, and he was very add-on dependent. Basically, he needed an add-on that made him faster when he teleported to a survivor. Now that add-on is partially base kit. The duration of his invincibility overclock mode that makes pallets explode around him is longer as well by default. His add-ons and his base kit has been reworked a little bit as well. It's now very easy to find survivors in your cameras. If you hold left control on them, you automatically snap into a survivor that's in view, which is a super useful quality of life change. You can also remotely remove unnecessary cameras without getting close to them, which can come in handy a little bit as well. And he even has a couple new add-ons here and there that are pretty damn good. The idea with this killer is that you basically, once you find yourself in chase, you never ever lose that survivor. With many other killers that will come up later, after hitting a survivor, they make a lot of distance, and then, yep, they reach safety, and then it's over. With this killer, after a survivor slipstream, you can teleport to them, and after you hit them, you can teleport to them again. You will always be very, very close, and you will be testing them constantly about their knowledge and how to play against this killer. There are a few tricks that survivors can do to kind of put you at bay, some high-level tricks that they can do against this killer. For example, when they vault a window, they can strategically wait at a certain place to make sure that if you teleport, you'll be on the wrong side of the window. They can do something similar with pallets as well. But keep in mind that if you are experienced, you can also find your own ways to counterplay all of this. The most effective way to counter this killer in general is to be very, very aggressive with the EMP usage. If a teammate is being chased, you go and you EMP it. But keep in mind, EMPs have been nerfed and now you waste more time getting them compared to before. So all of these little changes that have come since the last tier list have made Hux, honestly, an incredibly oppressive killer. One thing that also helps it, even though it's a bit of metagaming, is the fact that he's quite rare. Many, many people that go against this killer do not know how to play against it. Even good survivors that would give you a really hard time against other killers have simply not played enough against Singularity to know what to do, let alone the whole team being coordinated enough to deal with it. We had a brief moment where Thrill the Hunt was incredibly OP as a Hex perk and allowed other Hex perks to stay in the game for a long time. And this killer was so good at monitoring his cameras that he could literally prevent totems from pretty much ever being cleansed. That has been nerfed a little bit, but make no mistake, this killer is still incredibly good with Hex perks. He's incredibly good with slowdown. He's incredibly good at locking down one area and making 3 gens last forever. And with other killers that do this, the solution is typically, oh, just go back to the other side of the map. He can teleport and he can catch you while you do that. He is like a hack that sets up in like 5 seconds, and that is actually really, really deadly in chase. Much, much stronger than the best hack ever was in a lot of ways. A very, very, very nasty killer. He does suffer a little bit more from body blocks and altruism than some of the other killers around here, but still incredibly, incredibly powerful. We then have the Spirit. The Spirit is another killer that has fallen off quite a bit. If you check out some old tier lists, she used to be number 2, according to a lot of people. But she has fallen off for mostly good reasons, for mostly fair reasons. Super quick summary, but basically after the Spirit was released, sometime after, she got some buffs, some quality of lives, and she was incredibly, incredibly good. She didn't have any animation when she vaulted windows, so she could mind game you at windows. She could actually detect a survivor when she was using her power next to it, which made hitting survivors super, super easy. She had perks to basically outplay things like Iron Whale super, super easily. Her add-ons were insane. Literally insane, made her really fast, made her recover super quick. Many of them were bugged and did more things than they should have. And also she had some add-ons that were just honestly awful. Like, for example, one that allowed her to grab survivors out of gens without any noise notification, right? On top of that, she also didn't have any kind of tell when she was using her power, other than maybe some subtle animation reset, which meant that if a spirit stood still, you didn't really know if she was using her power or not, which allowed many spirits to just mind game you for free. All of these things that I mentioned have changed. She now has an audio queue where she is. Her add-ons are overall much weaker. Many of them have been reworked, and the ones that were bugged have been corrected, so she doesn't get any effects for free. And yeah, overall, survivors have gotten a little bit stronger. It's also worth pointing out that survivors have access to perks like Iron Whale and Off the Record, both of which can make them completely quiet, making them a little bit difficult, a little bit more difficult to track. Some spirit players might also opt to run perks like Genetic Limits to make sure that survivors are exhausted, which robs them of perks like Iron Whale and also exhaustion perks like Spring Burst and so on, right? So yeah, this is another killer that sometimes might feel like you want to spend a perk slot to counter one of your weaknesses, similar to Billy running Bamboozle. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that at high MMR, quote unquote, I tend to see a lot of the quietest survivors in the game. It's true, Feng Min is really popular, but I see a lot of Aces, I see a lot of Renatos, I see a lot of characters that are honestly a little bit hard to track sometimes. That being said, the reason, after talking about all of these negatives, the reason why Spirit is still so high in the tier list, and despite having fallen off a little bit, she's still really, really strong, is because you have always something to go by, whether it is scratch marks or a crow or hearing their breathing sounds or hearing their injury sounds or their footsteps or the dust that they kick up. A player that specializes on Spirit and listens really carefully and plays with like 200% volume like every single Spirit does is honestly very difficult to shake off. It's very, very difficult to shake off. And unlike any of the other killers that we've talked about here, you sometimes don't know what you did wrong against the Spirit. You can crouch around the corner and she could have a purple add-on to detect you with Killer Instinct. So you never really understand what amount of information she has. And really, really good players honestly look super stupid playing against the Spirit sometimes, let alone bad players. Bad players get eaten up by this killer all the time. She is incredibly good at forcing 50-50s. She's incredibly good at catching survivors in places that other killers would have to spend a little bit of time getting rid of. The only thing that we can begin to describe as a bit of a weakness is that she's 110 by default, so she doesn't have any help there. Every other killer that we've talked about so far, with the exception of Nurse, of course, is 115, if I remember correctly. And she doesn't have any insane mobility from her add-ons anymore. Her best add-ons do not give her the insane map mobility that she used to have, which means that on the larger maps, you could struggle a little bit. But then again, you know, that can be said for pretty much every other killer, especially from now on. Next up, we go to the A- tier. The killers here are all pretty damn fearsome, especially if you are a one-trick main and you play a lot of them and know all of their tricks. Even if you're not, I think they have a pretty significant advantage against the average survivor team. Some of them have very oppressive 1v1 gameplay. Some of them maybe take a little bit of time to build up, but then can damage multiple survivors or survivors in sequence very, very quickly and go through health states really, really fast. So these killers are overall pretty damn strong. Some of them are also propped up by like specific add-ons that make them particularly nasty. Now, the first surprise that you might see here is the Houndmaster, the last killer to be added in the DVD roster. Now, let me make no mistake. The Houndmaster would be somewhere down in the C tier. When she came out, the Houndmaster was incredibly buggy, incredibly inconsistent, and honestly, even if you removed all of her inconsistencies and her power worked perfectly, she would have maybe gone up one tier. Maybe she would be around Deathslinger levels of strength. She would be maybe before or after Deathslinger, somewhere around that time. However, before going on Christmas vacation, the developers gifted us with a little change that changes everything, really. They made this killer insane. They made the hitbox of the dog more forgiving. They made the cooldown of the dog 3 seconds. That is the shortest cooldown of any power so far. Even Dracula is 10 seconds. Even Spirit is 15 seconds default if you use all of your power. Her power is now 3 seconds. What else? Well, the most important one probably, there's quite a few changes, but the most important that you need, yeah, they changed a bunch of other things since the PTB, but the most important one that you need to know of is that they changed the logic of the dog. The dog no longer brings survivors into super random spots as much, and the vaulting speed of the dog has been pretty much doubled. What this means is that before, a survivor vaulting a window was not super in danger against this killer, because if you send the dog out, it was very slow, they could react to it, and even if you control the dog on the other side, there's a really good chance they would juke you or end up doing something that would make you waste more time, so you wouldn't even bother sometimes, right? Now, a survivor vaulting a window or dropping a pallet or vaulting a pallet, if they're in front of you, they're dead. They are literally dead. You can prepare your power really quickly. You send the dog, and the dog goes through the window literally at the speed of light. I cannot overstate, I'm really not exaggerating, just how late you can begin to use your power and you will still hit a survivor. The best part is that unlike other killers, if you catch a survivor mid-vault, they immediately take damage, right? If they're animation. And if you catch them on the other side of a pallet, you can break the pallet, get rid of it permanently, and still get the hit. And this is in stark contrast to other killers such as Billy or Slinger. For example, with Billy, if you get the hit with the low pro chains, yeah, you get the hit and you get the pallet, but you don't down them. And if you're playing Slinger, you can injure them and put them into deep wound. But if they're already injured, you cannot do that. The only killer that can destroy you around pallets as much is maybe the Artist. But she needs to have hit you with a bird prior and set up a bird, which is much, much slower. And another example could be, I suppose, Huntress, but she needs to have her hatchet ready up. And it's a lot less forgiving. And you need a very specific angle. Whereas this killer doesn't even need an angle. She can hit you from different angles and automatically goes through the window and can be controlled afterwards. Her ability to hit survivors in almost every situation is honestly quite scary. The best survivors that I've seen perform relatively well against me in chase just bait pallets. They don't even drop them. They just pretend to be at the pallet and hope that they waste enough of your time. But if that wasn't enough, if her ability to catch survivors a loop wasn't enough, she also has other little tools that are actually pretty damn difficult. The fact that you can hold one survivor hostage for a little bit sometimes allows you to have a survivor busy while you hit someone else. You can kick a gen and then hit a survivor. You can multitask in a lot of mean ways. If someone's body blocked them, you can keep them busy while you hit someone that they were trying to protect. You can also use the dog to search for survivors and give yourself a speed boost, which is pretty damn useful and gives this killer a little bit of mobility that some other killers in the A- tier do not have, which is great. It also allows you to check on your totems. Her add-ons also allow survivors to be forced to scream, which can have good synergies with perks like Throw the Hunt or other hex builds. So yeah, pretty disgusting stuff. I do think she can probably be considered to be lower if survivor or stay around this place if survivors eventually learn all of the intricate counterplays to her. But as it stands, you could even make the argument that she's stronger than I just made her. Compared to Spirit, compared to Twins, compared to Dracula, compared to Artist and Plague that we'll talk about, or Pyramid Head, this killer can do all of this and still benefit from a lot of other perks that these killers cannot do or cannot use very well. Surge, Know It, Save the Best for Last, Rapid Brutality, all of these basic attack perks that are not usable by killers that use their special attacks are actually usable by her. So she is a very mean killer with builds that include Into Down from perks like Starstruck. So that's another advantage. Yeah. Overall, needless to say, I think she's very overtuned. Compared to the other killers that we've talked about recently or that we'll talk about afterwards, she is not only strong, but also incredibly easy to play. You really do not need an MIT degree to play this killer. And the counterplay to her is just honestly sad. It's just split up, hide, pretend to use pallets, don't actually use pallets, die in corner, hope for the best. So yeah, I do think and I expect that this killer, after some time when the devs are back and they look at the data, they will most likely nerf her. When she is nerfed, if my guess is correct, she will probably be somewhere close to Deathslinger or maybe a little bit below if they adjust her the way I imagine they will. But who knows? We've had other killers be very, very out of whack for a long time, so maybe she will stay very, very strong for a long time. Next up is the Artist, pardon me for that. We have a killer here that has immense potential. She can send birds that cover the entirety of the map. This allows her to harass people off gens and objectives from a very long distance. At worst, you will waste their time. At maybe gain some information about where they are or are not, and at best you can even injure or down them. She is also quite fearsome from up close. Yeah, the birds are a little bit difficult to use. She's one of the hardest killers to pick up, but if you know what you're doing, you can pretty much shut down any loop in the entire game. She also has some purple add-ons that can make her more lethal at both of these things. You have add-ons that spread the bird damage to multiple survivors, which makes it very, very risky to body block. You have add-ons that reveal auras of survivors near her birds, which makes her counterplay in small loops basically non-existent. Your best bet against the Artist is to run to the next loop, run to the next loop, run to the next loop, maybe have a teammate come in and run into some of the birds to temporarily disable them, right? But all of this can fall flat really, really quickly. And good Artists, let me just tell you, they are terrifying. Compared to some of the higher tier killers, she does not have the immediate threat of an insta-down or the immediate threat of completely overwhelming someone in chase. She does sometimes end up mind gaming herself and requires quite a lot of skill compared to some of the other killers, compared to the results that you get. But she's a very, very, very strong killer. So make no mistake of that. Now, one thing that you need to understand as well is that auto beating on her is really, really popular for a very good reason. She can use it to damage and keep tabs of people, interrupt heals, make sure no one gets healed under a hook, or even use it from up close to make some really, really nasty hits from behind walls that survivors don't predict. With the nerf of the perk Distortion, this killer now sees a little bit more of a reason to run these perks, but she also has other perks that are perfectly good. She's good defending totems, even though it's not a popular playstyle. She's good with perks like Deadman Switch, which has been buffed recently. Or rework to last longer, and she can proc this from across the map as well. And she obviously doesn't mind taking someone far away for a pain res or some scorch hook, because she can get information on survivors pretty damn quickly. Overall, I think that this killer falls off very, very sharply if you do not use her birds appropriately. In fact, we have data from community stats that tell us that the Artist is one of the lowest kill rate killers, and I don't think necessarily it is because she's bad. On the contrary, I think it's because she's difficult, and when you don't know what you're doing, you end up hurting yourself. It's one of those killers that literally doesn't get anything done if you just keep shooting birds mindlessly and spamming them mindlessly. However, the good synergy with perks, the good synergy with the effectiveness of some of her top add-ons, and the fact that it's a killer that can damage multiple survivors, make body blocking difficult, it does make her an overall great candidate to be here in the A- tier. Now, one thing that is worth discussing, maps with elevation hurt her a little bit. If you find yourself on a map with gens on different floors, she unfortunately cannot deal with that as easily. Maps that are very, very, very large also suffer from a similar problem where you don't have a great grasp on the gens. Even if you bother them, survivors can just eventually get rid of the birds. You're not really a threat from afar as much. And maps that have a lot of interconnected safety can also be a problem, because you'll find that survivors never stay in one loop. You shut down one loop, they go to the next one, and they keep doing this until you run out of birds and they've wasted enough of your time. Good artists find ways to deal with this, but as I said, it is a little bit challenging. We next have the Plague. And let me just tell you, this tier list considers all of the add-ons a little bit, right? But if we didn't consider any add-ons, or if we only considered brown or yellow add-ons, the Plague would probably not be this high up. You have a killer that, other than making survivors infected and eventually injured semi-permanently, she doesn't really have anything super, super crazy, right? Yeah, she can pick up her fountain, but survivors could just not cleanse, and then she wouldn't have too many of them, right? Until maybe the end game. So that really would make this killer definitely a threat, but nowhere near as powerful as she currently is. I think Plague is one of the killers that really gets propped up by her add-ons and gets carried by her add-ons. It is honestly a miracle to me that you don't see more people playing Plague, considering how disgusting her add-ons are. For teams that decide to stay injured, you have an add-on that reveals their aura constantly. Unlike before, Distortion is nowhere near as popular or as effective, so you're going to be able to see the whole team and be able to exploit almost any mistake, sometimes find people that are dead on hook. You also have an iridescent add-on that gives you one charge of your 40 seconds of your red power, which means that even if you don't have any fountains in the map, you still get at least 5 uses of your power. You can make that power last 60 seconds with another add-on. And if you have perks like Deadlock and Tinkerer, you literally force survivors to eat through those time. It's honestly super disgusting. Some of her other add-ons are not quite as impactful, but are still really, really nasty. The Apple add-ons allow her to have extra fountains, which on some maps are really, really deadly. She also has a sneaky brown add-on that is a bit of a meme add-on, but actually catches a lot of survivors off guard. So yeah, making survivors injured immediately tests the constitution and the overall coordination of survivors. If they don't have the same strategy, they often flop and fold immediately. If they're all on the same page and they're all sticking to the same strategy, whether it is to cleanse super aggressively and split up, or whether it's to stay injured and, force you to use fountains that maybe are a bit too far, then that can work a bit better. But overall, she's a little bit, she's definitely quite strong. Now let's talk about some weaknesses, okay? One of them is maps. Maps are a little bit odd for the Plague. She is very reliant on fountain spawns. If you spawn and you have a out of the white fountain in the middle of the map, you can use it and do a lot of damage. But if the white fountain that you get is on the edge of the map, you can't really pick it up. By the time you pick it up, everyone's already hidden. If survivors cleanse on the edges of the map, it's much harder to make use of them, right? Some maps have all of the fountains near the middle. Some maps have most of the fountains around the edges, like the swamp maps. So you do have a little bit of RNG, and this kind of sucks. You can even use chest offerings to remove chests which get replaced by fountains. A little bit of a funny interaction. On a slightly different note, the Plague also had some advantages a few patches ago that have disappeared. She's no longer able to hit survivors through a hook. This is something that she could do and made her really, really scary, especially when hook stages only lasted 60 seconds. Now they last 70. Whenever a survivor was unhooking another from the hook, you could basically X-ray and shoot through them. And I believe this has been taken out. She also is no longer able to puke on the hooks. This only lasted a little while, but for some time she could puke on a hook, and a survivor unhooking someone else would become infected, even if the survivor that is being rescued was not fully infected and ready to spread the infection. So she had a few strange things that have been taken out. And one fun fact about the Plague in this patch is that if you play her and you use her power, at the end of her power she goes blah, 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 blah. Like she does like a little gargling sound that is really bothersome to some people. It triggers some people, and for some reason it should only play when you cancel, but it plays even when you use your power. So that is a little bit annoying. But yeah, overall, the Plague is a little bit carried by her add-ons, but a very, very, very strong killer. At worst, you'll deal with an M1 killer that makes most people injured, and you can also play her like that. You can make a lot of people injured and rely on perks like Thanatophobia to slow down the game a lot, Pentimento if you have hexes, or Play With Your Food, or Coup de Grace, perks to make your M1s, more, make yourself like pretty much a Myers that just insta-downs everything. And even that is not absolutely terrible. And the fact that medkits are so strong and so common, and the Plague deals with them pretty nicely, already puts her above average here. Next up, we talk about Pyramid Head, aka the Executioner. Unlike some of the other killers higher up in the tier list, he doesn't have any insane mobility or any crazy information gathering tools. He cannot detect people from super far at the start of the game or anything like that. He is a mostly slow killer that survivors can predict and stay away from, and trust me, they want to stay away from him. The problem with this killer is that once he gets to within a certain critical distance of you, you are almost never safe. This killer can hit you through walls, through anything that isn't like an open gap. As long as there's not like an open air, like you're on a different platform or something like that, this killer can pretty much hit you anywhere. Yes, he has to take a little bit of a chance. Yes, it's a little bit of luck involved, unless he reads you correctly or has some auto reading, which is pretty common on him. But the fact that this killer can get you anywhere, no matter the pallet, the window, or the amount of teammates trying to body block, that is a problem. This makes him extremely volatile. In chase, you could go from 0 to 100 and go from like get a hit that damages multiple survivors, which he's capable of. One of the few killers that can do that. You can do this after unhooks or uncages as well. And the problem with this killer is that if you manage to get yourself tormented, you are at grave risk of being turbo tunneled. Yes, a survivor that comes off the hook can be chased, but they have protection. They have the base kit endurance, they might have perks like decisive, right? Stuff like that. But when you come out of a cage, you don't have any of these protections. You can be down immediately. So one thing that this killer can do relatively commonly is torment a survivor, send them on a cage, they get rescued from the cage, that survivor gets targeted, they go down, and now they're dead on hook. And in a very short period of time, you have a survivor that can be within minutes away of disappearing from the game completely, and then the rest of the game is going to be a massive drag. He uses passive slowdown perks really well. He can lock down gens relatively well with Eruption and other perks like that. He has quite a few options there. Of course, the thing worth highlighting now is that survivors have a tool against hardcore tunneling like this, which is called Shoulder the Burden. It's a new perk that allows a survivor to basically steal a hook stitch from someone else, but it doesn't work off cages, so they would need to do this at the perfect time, and they can easily put themselves in danger. And I think against this killer, unhooking in front of him, it can be quite dangerous as well. So even that is a little bit difficult to pull off, not to mention the fact that many teams will not have this perk, will not even bother using it. So against those teams, many of their hook-related perks will not work, straight up. So yeah, he's very, very good at dealing with this. Now, his add-ons, since one of the last tier lists, have actually improved a little bit. He has a mangled add-on, which he didn't have before. Some of his add-ons that used to be good, like the range add-ons, are still fine. He has not had a lot of changes, and they've tweaked a few others. Nothing huge. He doesn't get insanely boosted by add-ons like Plague does, but especially range and power duration can be okay. So overall, a killer that thrives based on his ability to tunnel one person off. And even if you don't play like that, if your survivors are not on point, the fact that you can get downed anywhere pretty much is a pretty big deal and justifies him being this high up. Next up, we have the Oni. The Oni is possibly, out of all the killers that we've talked about so far, the slowest one at the beginning. He starts out like a normal killer, and it needs to get blood by hitting survivors from healthy to injured. He also gets blood while these injured survivors go around the map and they drop blood orbs. And also, if you force him to do certain actions or run a certain add-on, which is quite popular, you get more blood and you can get into your power pretty quickly. Once you get into your power, you get approximately 45 seconds of goodiness, more if you have add-ons that extend the duration. During those 45-ish seconds, you can go nuts. You basically become a Billy that can go around the map really quickly, break through barricades like pallets or breakable walls really quickly, get insta-down, and even get multiple insta-downs if survivors are somehow corralled into getting close together. You can, it's a little bit difficult to do that. Keep in mind, every time you down a survivor, you lose a little bit of your power, so he's not as insane at he's not as ready on command as a killer like Blight or Billy, but he's arguably stronger than even those two when he has his power. Some killers also some Oni players also become really good at using his speed add-ons and learning his flicks. If you've seen a good Oni, they can sometimes chase you around something and do a 180 flick with their insta-down Demon Fury mode. So that's pretty scary, and nothing preventing you from learning that if you want to do that. So yeah. You have a killer that, much like Billy, can turn games on a dime. Yeah, it's true that the game starts out a little bit slow, but now you have more perks than ever to slow down the game passively and get those cheeky hits on people. And for the overwhelming majority of matches, the fact that you don't start out super strong is completely fine, because even the best survivors are caught off guard, and normally you have a choice of who to chase. So it's really not a huge deal. It is, however, a little bit of a weakness. Every now and then you will play Oni on a map like the game, where even his power can be stalled by just dropping repeatedly save and save pallets. In those maps, you will need to play a bit more strategically and maybe lock down some gens, but even in those, you still are likely to win if you're a really, really, really good Oni. He is one of the killers that has changed the least, I would say. You might notice that compared to some previous tier lists, he has dropped down a little bit. One of the reasons is because other killers have been propped up, and another is that he has lost access to one of the most disgusting perks that he had some time ago. He had a perk called Ultimate Weapon from the Xenomorph, which allowed him to basically go around the map and make people scream everywhere, and then he would just pick them off one by one. It was a very disgusting perk that was particularly good on the S tier killers and very good on him as well. This perk has been reworked and now doesn't do that effect, so you don't have such a good aggressive anti-stealth perk. But guess what? Perks like Distortion and stealth perks like Calm Spirit are now less popular than a few months ago, so you probably won't need them anyway. Another killer that has dropped off a little bit in the tier list is Wesker. Now, part of this, I think, comes down to the fact that survivors have just learned the counterplay to Wesker. This is a killer that has a little bit of everything, right? Has some insta-down, we'll get there, some ability, a little bit of utility with a bigger terror radius that can inflict some perks on people like that, although it doesn't play a huge role typically. A little bit of utility because you can vault pallets and windows, and sometimes that can give you an advantage. For example, if you follow a survivor out of a main building and they vault a window, you can vault it after them and you recover mid-fall. So vaulting good windows against Wesker can actually backfire sometimes. some nasty add-ons here or there that allow you to toss survivors and, you know, catch them quickly afterwards. So a little bit of utility here and there. Overall, survivors have gotten a little bit better at playing against him, which contributes towards making him a little bit less of a threat over time. And even though he did get a shorter cooldown buff, which was nice, he also got a significant nerf, which is the main reason for his drop. He no longer inflicts a 8% slowdown. I think it was 8%. Yeah, basically, whenever you were fully infected against Wesker, you were 8% slower. This, if you ever played against Wesker like this, you will remember it. This was a significant amount. Any survivor, Chupi honey, no digging the carpet. Any survivor that was fully infected against Wesker would be on a really, really tough mission to last even 10 seconds or 20 seconds in chase. Unless you had an incredibly good palette, he is going to catch you. Any loop on anything, he will catch you. So that was very, very oppressive. And another thing that is worth remembering is that when you became unhooked, the infection was paused at 50%. So if one of the things that Wesker could do very, very well a few patches ago was to tunnel people off hook. If you were tunnel off the hook, you don't have time to heal. You don't have time to use the spray to disinfect. So that means that you will become insta-downable, even if you have adrenaline or second win or get healed by further people or whatever. Even if you somehow get a magical heal mid-chase, you will become insta-downable to his power, and you will become 8% slower. Both of these things are now far less of an effect. The slowdown is only 4%, which is a significant thing, but not as oppressive as 8%. And when you come out of a hook, it now starts your infection at 1%, which means it would, I don't remember from the top of my head, but you can pretty much run for a whole minute at least before getting fully infected, which means that he no longer has the incredible pressure that he once had on you. So because he is less good at tunneling, and tunneling in general has become less effective as a result of some perks being introduced, and hook stages last longer as well, which gives survivors more time to bring a spray to an unhook. All of these things have hurt Wesker a tiny little bit, but he is still a solid A-tier killer with decent chase potential, decent potential to injure multiple survivors during unhooks and altruism, and even decent potential to sometimes get not quite instant downs, but get very, very close. I have a dog that's distracting me. Hello, dog. Hello, dog. I'm so sorry. He's really good at getting tosses against walls, edges of the map, and then following that up quickly. I'm going to give this dog a treat because he is harassing me. Hello. 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 Next up, we have the Unknown, another killer that has dropped a little bit since, since he has come out. The fact that survivors have learned the counterplay a little bit, he's a very good killer when it comes to punishing survivors during unhook and healing at the wrong places. But now survivors have slightly longer hook stages, which gives them a bit more leniency in here. And also some of his add-ons have been tweaked. On the one hand, his brown add-on that made him teleport really quickly has been nerfed a little bit, but made into base kit. This is like a slight nerf overall, but not too bad. And his two strongest add-ons that infect survivors at the start of the game and when they complete a janitor, especially that one, has been nerfed as well to have a downside. So this has relegated this killer to a slightly lower position in the tier list. Now, compared to other killers, the problem with the Unknown is that he is a little bit inconsistent, a little bit volatile. If you manage to land your hits, you do a weaken effect, and then the next one will damage. And you can do this to multiple survivors as well. So as I mentioned, during unhooks and during moments of altruism, this can backfire horribly for survivors. But it also means that they can get away with a lot of things if they look at you and dispel this. Survivors that look at the killer will get rid of the weakened effect. So compared to some of the other killers, he's the only killer so far that has an effect like this is the Artist, right? If you shoot a survivor with your bird and then don't find the right follow-up, the bird gets removed, and then you're back to the start and you go through cooldowns and nothing gets done. The Unknown can have moments like this where you hit one survivor and they take you far away and they see you through some loop that is a little bit difficult to shoot over, and you go on chases that extend for a bit longer than they should. However, This aside, we have a killer that has an ability that can hit you in a lot of different ways. It's a little bit difficult, not super beginner friendly, but it's an ability that can hit you through walls, that can hit you over obstacles, that can hit from below a floor, that can hit you sometimes across the map if he has a little bit of elevation, and also the underrated ability of teleporting to his own hallucinations. Survivors that are diligent in removing these hallucinations or staying away from them if possible will be fine, but teams that don't will find it quite oppressive. Being able to teleport across the map enables a lot of perks, and I am surprised at the sheer variety of builds that are actually really, really effective on him. Overall, strong killer, but rather restrained by the fact that you have to hit survivors multiple times. That would be the main caveat, that you can sometimes have games where you don't fully get all of the value. He is as difficult to get value as some of the high tier killers, but the high tier the killers that are higher tier sometimes insta down you or sometimes damage you outright instead of that middle ground. Still though, one of my favorite killers and possibly the best design killer they've done in a very, very long time. Moving on to the B tier, all of the killers that we have here, by the way, are not necessarily a lot weaker than the ones above, but they do have slightly more weaknesses, and they're not that much stronger always than the killers below. But what they do have in common, almost all of these killers, is that they actually test many things on the survivor. They put a certain amount of pressure on survivors, whether it is by forcing them to pick up items or deal with a power that affects multiple survivors at once, or like a very, very quick ability to escalate damage, such as Vecna or Huntress, if they make a big mistake. So these are killers that are a little bit more dependent on the survivor knowledge. And I think the first one, Vecna, is a great example. This is a killer that I also think has fallen off very, very slightly in the last few months, just because survivors begin to understand the counterplay, and also a few nerfs after release have finally set in place. He also received a change to his cooldowns that have made him a little bit easier to cycle through, but also have nerfed the duration of the hand. Overall, the mage hand that allowed him to pick up pallets ever since release, I think, has been only nerfed, because it was probably the most useful spell, I guess, in their stats. Anyway, so with Vecna, we have a killer with normal terror radius, normal stats, normal everything. That is good, that is fine. And then we have 4 spells. The Dispelling Sphere that allows you to find survivors and disable some of their magical items. The Mage Hand that allows you to block pallets from being dropped or pick them up. This is a bit of a double-edged blade. Sometimes you can pick up pallets that you really shouldn't and give them a second life. And unfortunately, you cannot use the Mage Hand to prevent pallet saves. But for the most part, if you use the hand right, it will get you hits here and there. Much like Doctor, that we'll talk about a little bit later, Vecna is one of those killers that can sometimes get hit even when every map is on the board, which not every killer can do. We then have the Skeletons, the Flight of the Damned. This is the most critical power of Vecna, in my opinion. If survivors know how to play around this power, the game becomes a lot harder. If survivors know when to vault, when not to, when to crouch, when not to, if they fall for... This is a power that you can spam from behind a wall, and if a survivor does not have like an instant reaction to crouching, they will get hit by it. So depending on how aware survivors are of how to play around this power, I think your game will become much easier or much harder. But either way, even at its worst, it is a power that allows you to zone. It is a power that allows you to hit multiple survivors sometimes. It is a power that with elevation can do a lot of tricky things. For example, if you are coming out from downstairs and they try to crouch, it's not going to work because you can use it on the middle of the stairs, right? And let's not forget that if you run a specific iridescent add-on, the power is on ground floor. So this is an add-on that requires you to specialize in it. But if you do spend the time to get really good with that add-on, which is the iridescent book, you will be able to hit survivors everywhere, and the counterplay, it's a bit, you require a bit more precision, but the counterplay begins to disappear, and that can be a little scary if you get good at that. Other notable add-ons for this killer include things like reducing cooldowns, making survivors deal with more trap chests that don't actually have items. Overall, in a lot of matches, survivors opening chests results in them not getting much in result, but there's also games where it's the opposite. In maps with multiple floors, like Midwich, if a survivor that you're chasing goes into a locker and disappears into another locker with the Hand of Vecna, that can actually be really, really crippling. And this is something that can really throw you off in endgames, where you're desperately trying to down one guy to then go pick up another and get your final 2 kills, and then one of them teleports to the other side of the map. That can be a little rough. So the items sometimes don't do much, sometimes can mess with you quite a bit, and it's a little bit difficult to stay aware of who has who and who can see your aura when you fly and so on. But yeah, overall, it's a pretty strong killer. If you specialize in using specific add-ons, I think he gets even better. And some perks on this killer that are not super useful on others actually are pretty nasty, such as Rapid Brutality, for example. Keep in mind that as of this patch, you have gained a new ability to survivors could basically prevent you from going through a window before. They can no longer do that, but windows and pallets are still relatively safe for survivors. If you fly over one of these places, the survivor can typically always vault back, so you don't have the ability to mind game survivors at windows and get free hits the way Houndmaster or Dracula can. So he's a little bit more restrained there. Basically, you have a lot of tools that against average survivors are going to be horribly difficult on them. Against really good survivors, I think he falls off a little bit, but he still has enough tools and enough mobility and enough information gathering that if you use all of them, he still feels above average to me. A lot of little tricks, as I explained with Flight of the Dam. And I think this is, if you want to main one killer and don't mind using certain add-ons and learning to play with specific add-ons, I think this killer is definitely for you. We then have the Huntress, and Huntress is honestly, it's pretty crazy. She used to be like number 2 or number 3, yeah, probably number 3 killer for a very long time. And in almost any tier list, I would have placed her a little bit higher, maybe on the A tier. Arguably, you could still place her on the A tier. Honestly, if you place her right around the unknown, I think that would be perfectly fair. Now, one thing to keep in mind with Huntress is that hook stages are now a little bit longer. The game can be stalled by survivors a little bit more effectively. You still have a lullaby that does not allow you to use stealth perks very effectively. Some of the better perks in the game have you waste a little bit of time, which as a killer that has to reload, you don't super love. And the ability of Hunters to shed through through health states really quickly becomes a little bit less relevant due to perks such as Shoulder the Burden and Reassurance and the aforementioned 70-second hook stages, right? So, for example, a few years ago, if you were Huntress and you put someone in the basement, this could be really nasty. With cooldown add-ons, which are yellow and brown add-ons, even just a yellow add-on, you can basically make it impossible for people to get through you. And keep in mind, the Huntress has been buffed. She now has 7 hatchets by default. Doesn't need add-ons to have extra. That's all you get. She still has the insta-down, but it's not as ridiculous as it used to be. And some of her other add-ons have like nice little effects like auto-reading, a little bit of stealth, and so on. Honestly, it comes down to just the fact that a lot of maps are not super helpful for her, that a lot of maps still have really poor spread of lockers and not the most generous hitboxes. But this is another killer that if you want to specialize in, and especially if you want to go the extra mile of like using specific add-ons and getting used to like the faster wind up or the faster holding speed from the shiny pin, if you want to specialize in this killer, she will get pretty damn ridiculous. And the same can be said for some of the killers that we talked about before and that we'll talk about afterwards. At the end of the day, she's just a little bit slower, doesn't have the best synergies, relies a little bit more on passive slowdown perks, which are decent, but she's not the best at using them. And, you know, has to adapt to maps a little bit more than other killers. And next up, we have quite a surprise. In most of the tier lists, Nemesis would have been pretty far away from Huntress. It would have been pretty crazy to think that he's anywhere close. But the Nemesis has received a very significant glow up. Let's begin with the zombies. His zombies have not really changed much at all. They still are messy, they still get stuck, they still don't do much other than give you occasional information, maybe help you, maybe once per match significantly. They have really not changed too much, and the add-ons concerning zombies have also remained mostly the same. However, a lot of things have changed in the normal gameplay, the part that you can control about Nemesis. He now gets to tier 2 with only 5 mutation points instead of 6. This means that with a single survivor, you can get to tier 2 consistently. With certain add-ons, even quicker. Before, you would need 2 survivors to get to tier 2 consistently, or 1 add-on and hope for the best, you know? So basically getting to tier 2 is important because that is the stage where Nemesis begins to break pallets. It's where Nemesis really starts becoming a menace, and dropping pallets, even really good pallets against him, becomes a necessity sometimes, but definitely not a very efficient way of keeping him away from you. He's also possibly the best wall breaker in the entire game. If you have to go through a wall, you can break it with your tentacle in tier 2 and go through it with no animation or locking yourself in place. He's pretty much unlike any other killer in that regard. You can also break them from up to six or so meters away, which is a big deal. When you get to tier 3, by the way, you now have an extra half meter of distance as of the recent buffs. And for anyone that plays Nemesis, I cannot, they are honestly so happy about this. You can hit survivors so consistently at that little bit of extra distance that makes things like Shack incredibly unsafe against him. It makes getting away from him even harder. He can break pallets from even further. It gets pretty disgusting. However, the main change that has made Nemesis feel so good is the fact that now the infection comes with a significant hinder. In the past, when Nemesis infected you with this tentacle, you got hindered, slowed down, but only a tiny little bit for a tiny amount of time. It was honestly super unnoticeable. His add-on, the Liquor Tongue, which was supposed to slow down more, was basically a joke. It did nothing. Now it's the opposite. The Liquor Tongue has become one of his best add-ons, maybe his best add-on. When you slow down a survivor, they literally walk so slow that Nemesis doesn't feel like he has to hit you 3 times anymore. It feels like he only has to hit you 2.5 times, because the second hit comes so soon after, typically, that yeah, it's a very significant upgrade. So we have a killer that is very good in the 1v1, has a little bit of help against the team with zombies, as well as now being able to get to the point where he can break pallets really quickly within typically one chase. Whereas before, if survivors split up to reach 6 points, it was actually a lot harder. You had to hit a survivor maybe 3 times and then kill 1 zombie or hit multiple survivors. So that has done wonders for Nemesis. I would say the worst enemy of Nemesis is still zombies that are inconsistent and and honestly just maps. In the bigger maps, survivors spreading out will probably expose some of his flaws. Namely the fact that he doesn't have any insane mobility. If at the start of the game survivors split up and your first chase takes a little bit long, maybe you go for a fancy tentacle and you miss, and then you get your first down, but you don't have enough slowdown, maybe by then you're not going to feel that strong. Otherwise, though, a fairly strong killer in the current meta. Next up, we talk about Pinhead, aka the Cenobite, a killer with a passive ability that forces survivors to deal with the box and pick it up. It is a really good user of a lot of different perks, some of which are not super popular, like Rapid Brutality. He also uses hexes, which are fairly strong right now, pretty damn well, because since survivors already have one objective, their gens, and one side objective, the box, now adding extra side objectives make things very hectic. So this is one of those killers that offers a bit of a bive check. If the team is not biving appropriately, they will go down really quickly. He has not received any super major changes. The developers have announced that they will change something about Pinhead in the future. We'll see if that's a buff or a nerf, but he remains a serviceable killer that has decent anti-loop, decent slowdown globally, and some insane ability to make games feel like an absolute slog, like a really, really sluggish mess for survivors. Keep in mind that if the hunt is going on, they cannot do gens effectively, they cannot heal effectively. More importantly, they cannot deal with totems like Throw the Hunt, Devour Hope, and so on effectively, which is really, really nasty. And he's also one of those killers that has a few add-ons that you can specialize in. If you want to learn the Iridescent Fang and specialize in that and become a damaging from afar killer, you could try that. And you can also just snipe people with very, very long distance chains using Frank's Heart, for example. Other than that, the add-ons to slow down the cube are incredible. Anytime you find the cube yourself or you down a survivor with the cube, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, basically, because you're getting your first hook, but also you're slowing everyone else down and resetting the whole thing. So yeah, he really hasn't changed too much. He is a killer that is honestly on a really, really decent spot. He has a good ratio of being very strong, testing the team in a 1v1, testing the team in a 1v4, and being strong but reasonable given his difficulty. Some things to keep in mind about this killer, some of his weaknesses. Keep in mind that maps with multiple floors make the spawns very hectic. It's difficult to find the box at times. Survivors that have accelerated walking speed are also faster while chained. So if you have someone with the perk Fixated from Nancy, they can counter you and you might not realize why. And also his chains have a little bit of RNG, especially if you're not using the purple impaling wire. Whenever you hit a survivor with a chain, honestly, sometimes it feels like they are locked in place and they can't go anywhere. And sometimes the chains just break immediately. And some of that, not all of it, but some of that comes down to luck. And that doesn't feel great. This is also not a killer that is incredibly good at dealing with body blocks. Vecna, Huntress, Unknown, Wesker, every killer before. Nemesis, not so much. But from now on, we start to have killers that don't deal with body blocks nearly as well. So he does have a few weaknesses there. Overall, though, very, very solid character. Next up, we have the Deathslinger. The Deathslinger is a killer that is a bit more of a standardized Huntress. He doesn't have the unique 110. He doesn't have a lullaby. He doesn't need to reload at lockers. Overall, in a 1v1, is arguably stronger than Huntress, especially if you have the add-ons to recover faster and reload quicker after breaking a chain. However, he also doesn't have as much explosiveness by default, whereas Huntress can damage survivors very, very quickly if given the opportunity. The Slinger has a bit more of a limited potential just because after every shot he has to reload. And no matter how good of a slinger you are not going to get 5 downs in 5 seconds. That's just the way it is. Now, one thing to consider, however, is that Slinger reels survivors to him and hits them with a basic attack. That does mean that you can use instant perks a little bit more effectively than Huntress. And one of the ways that the Deathslinger can actually shoot up in the tier list a little bit is by using the Iridescent Coin. The Iridescent Coin allows you to insta down survivors that are shot a little bit further than usual, like 14 meters or further. When you shoot them, you can see that you get more points, so you'll know if it's an insta-down. So this does make him quite a threat. Keep in mind, though, it's quite map-dependent. You don't necessarily want to be camping hooks for the same reason as we explained earlier on Huntress. It's not as effective anymore. But yeah, we have a killer that, for the most part, is consistent in chase, can even have a bit of an oomph with insta-down, and can actually use a little bit of stealth here and not. Unfortunately, this killer has a few awkward things to him. He is a killer that has a 1v4 delay ability. He can put survivors into deep wound, right? Which, for example, Legion can use to slow down in the 1v4. Legion can apply deep wound, and then chase a 4th guy, right? And then those people have to waste time. But as a Slinger, you rarely ever leave people in deep wound to go for someone else. It is not something you can afford because you don't have any extreme mobility to go around the map if survivors split up, and you don't have any particular information gathering tools. In fact, I would argue that Deathslinger, unless you're using some kind of stealth build, has less information than other killers because anytime you shoot your gun, you actually scare the crows off. So sometimes if you see a crow coming back, it might not be a survivor that bothered it. It might have been you when you shot your gun. So he's a little bit below average in those aspects. And as a result, you will mostly want to focus on one survivor, make a very, very short chase, apply some kind of slowdown or lethality perks to other survivors, and then like be ruthlessly efficient in the 1v1. I don't think that as a Slinger, you are capable compared to other killers in around the tier list. You're not capable of going around the whole map, chasing everyone a little bit. You're simply not that fast. You're simply not that lethal. You have to play into your strengths, which is the gun and being able to shoot through small gaps and being able to injure survivors, even if they are vaulting a pallet. Sometimes even shoot them through a window, reel them, and hit them through the window. The ability to be so oppressive when you're close up to a survivor is what makes the Slinger really decent. Some, with some alternative playstyles aside. So for that reason, this killer depends a little bit more than some of the other ones on perks. It honestly feels incredible if survivors are being clumsy, and can be very difficult if they're splitting up effectively. So I do think he is a killer that is a little bit more restrained, but honestly, if Deathslinger was the average killer, like, I would be more than happy. This is a great killer. It feels super satisfying to land shots. It feels super satisfying to learn places in the map where you can shoot a survivor and then reel them and hit them over a fence. It is a very rewarding killer. It's possibly the most accessible range killer if you're looking to pick up a killer that is range as a beginner to intermediate. I think he's a great choice, and I love him. He's great, but definitely not as strong as some of the other characters. There is a long debate on whether or not the Slinger is better than the Huntress. Let's talk about that for a moment. A lot of people consider Slinger to be better than Huntress because, strictly speaking, in a professional competitive setting, Slinger typically outperforms Huntress. And that is just down to the fact that Huntress has to wind up and is a little bit more predictable. People have a lot of experience, and the Deathslinger, if you're close, you shut down a lot of things way quicker. The problem, however, is that in your average, even high MMR lobby, survivors open themselves up to mistakes a lot more, and I think Huntress overall takes advantage of these mistakes a little bit faster and more ravenously than the Deathslinger. If you have 3 people in front of you as Deathslinger, you're gonna walk out of there with 1 injury, maybe 2 if you're a bit lucky, right? Whereas the Huntress can sometimes create madness very quickly. Moving on to another killer that is really difficult to rate, that has also fallen off quite significantly in the tier list, we have the Hag. And honestly, the Hag is a curious case. Some time ago, I placed her like close to the top 5 or within the top 5 of the tier list. I really think she was that good back then. Some people nowadays classify her as the lowest of the low, like D tier next to Trapper. And I think right now the truth is probably somewhere in between. To be completely fair, the things that made Hag super oppressive back then, some of them are gone. Keep in mind, back then, a survivor that was off the hook could be hit immediately and go right back on the hook. That made Hag really powerful. Even there was no perk back then that could defend you against a mistake like that. Nowadays, hook stages take longer. Survivors are generally more aware of basement and other mistakes, and Hag doesn't have that incredible potential to completely turn a game upside down like that. On the other hand, she has received some small quality of life and some small base kit buffs that don't make a huge difference, but that are a welcome addition. The reason why some people, by the way, consider Hag to be like a bottom tier killer, it might come down to 2 things. Number 1, she plays different from every other killer. There are some people that play this killer, they put one trap down, and then they chase a survivor, and then they wonder why they don't get anything done. If you play this killer like other killers, forget about it. You're going to do super poorly. You're going to burn yourself out. You're not going to have any fun, and it's going to be really miserable. You could run the add-on that makes her move at like normal or higher than normal speed, the waterlock shoe, and that's like its own little chase hack meme. But, other than that, you probably don't want to play her like that, right? What you need to do with Hag is basically just put a bunch of traps, do not get baited and hope that survivors are not very good at disrupting them. Wait for your time. Eventually, you will have one person in the hook, one person injured, and things are going to go down. And this happens in the overwhelming majority of games. The other type of people that think the Hag is bad is people that play in very high level control environments like competitive and tournaments. In tournaments, Hag is obviously a different monster. The people that play the tournament know that it's a Hag because of the rules, and they are prepared and they are willing to take a hit and then go to the other side of the map and wait 20 minutes to get healed if necessary and play very long games. And in those matches, since the Hag never gets a down, she never gets anything to defend, and if she never gets anything to defend, she's not a very good defensive killer. But let me just be frank with you. That will almost never happen in your matches. It will be extremely, extremely rare that you find survivors that play professionally against the hag. More often than not, survivors will start to do a gen, go around the map. By the time they notice it's even a hag, you've already laid out half your traps. And, you know, much like Spirit, this is a killer that can make really good survivors look absolutely stupid. From my experience, I think hag still is decently fine and decently good. Some of the problems with hack recently, other than the whole hook stages being longer, survivors now being able to control hook stages a little bit more with their perks and whatnot, it still remains relatively easy for a single good survivor to mess with you. There is a very simple trick that you can do. Well, the first thing that you can do with a trap is to walk up to it, crouch, and disarm it. This is good, but why would you do that? One thing that you can do is literally walk into the trap and then walk out, and if the hack teleports at the precise moment where you trigger it, she still doesn't hit you. There are some tricks that you can do to try to like bait a survivor, but let's be honest, if the survivor knows what they're doing, they will waste your time. Meanwhile, 2 or 3 people are doing gens in the background. Another trick that you can do is to walk towards a trap, run towards a trap, looking backwards. If you look backwards while running towards a trap, your camera will automatically do a pivot and you will automatically run out. This means that you can do this during chase. If you're chased by a hack and she's seeing you walk in front of you and you trigger a trap, most of the time she's going to teleport right away. If you're doing this, you will be out of range by the time she swings. So yeah, it is really, really free to mess with a hack. And at times when you lose a game to having 1 or 2 survivors disrupting you like this, it can feel really, really, really bad. I say if this happens to you, do not give up. There are ways to outplay this and bait survivors. And even if you have 1 survivor disrupting you, as long as it doesn't let you, as long as it doesn't let you get out of your flow of placing traps and pressuring other people, I think it is okay. You can still win many of your games like this. But yeah, we're saying now that her slower playstyle is starting to fall out a little bit of the tempo that survivors can push on you. Next up, we have the Xenomorph, and this is one of the killers that most people find outrageous in my tier list. They think this killer is much, much higher. They think it's at least as good as Huntress, maybe even somewhere in the A tier next to Wesker or Unknown. And I'm so sorry, I just don't see it. Let's just address the elephant in the room. This killer has a mechanic into the map that survivors can use to slow it down. It's called the flame turrets, right? Survivors can pick up turrets. These turrets, even if they are not particularly well placed, they do a little beeping noise, beep, 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 that extends like 40 meters. So even though this killer has a smaller turret radius, the stealth component on this killer is not very good. It's a little bit like Huntress, because any survivor next to a turret will hear a little beeping noise indicating how close you are. So stealth on this killer is not incredible for that regard. But yeah, the turrets can be well placed and be an actual hindrance, or can be badly placed and be a nothing burger. In my experience, the overwhelming amount of the overwhelming majority of survivors out there are not very good at placing turrets. They place them at the wrong times. They get caught at the start of the match placing them. They place them in a part of the map where the gens aren't done and I never go there. Yeah, they do a really, really bad job. And I think it's fair to give credit where credit is due. This killer is a little bit better because people are inexperienced and the Xenomorph is not necessarily a super common killer. Right, so even though correct usage of the flame turrets is incredibly crippling if survivors know what they're doing, most of the times you're not going to go against that. And that is good. That is a good thing. Thank God survivors don't know how to use turrets. If you're curious, one of the ways that survivors can use turrets effectively is to put 2 of them together. If you put 2 of them together, no matter which one the kill destroy, he's going to lose power. You can also put them on elevation, on little hills, and then the killer cannot basic attack them. If you are forced to use your whip, your tail, you lose more time, so that can be bad as well. You can also put them a little bit on the edges of a loop in such a way that if a survivor is looping you there, you don't have the ability to quickly break it. You have to go out of your way, and that gives survivor more distance. So yeah, you might sometimes find yourself playing this killer, and even survivors that are not insanely good, they run to one loop with one turret. You chase them, you break the turret, they go to another one, you chase them, there's another turret you need to get rid of, and you get nothing done. And that can be pretty bad. Thank God that is not super common. Most survivors are not very smart. Either they don't use turrets very well, or worse, they waste time using them, right? Now, the main reason, in my opinion, why this killer is this slow is its lack of potential. Its lack of nuclear options. The Xenomorph is a pretty amazing killer. They have a smaller turret radius than normal. They have, I would say, mobility above the average because they can teleport through tunnels. They also have detection that is above average because they can find people through the tunnels. And they have an attack that hits over obstacles. It cannot hit you over everything, but it's kind of like a Huntress with a short distance hatchet, right? It can be pretty nasty, and the recovery on the attack is pretty quick. So multiple survivors grouping up, you're not going to down all of them at once or injure all of them at once like Pyramid Head can do, but you can pretty much get a hit, and get a hit shortly after. So this is a killer that can be pretty damn nasty. However, it doesn't have any insane add-ons compared to other killers. As we explained earlier, Slinger has an insta-down add-on, Huntress has an insta-down add-on, and a lot of really nasty cooldown add-ons. Vecna has an add-on that if you get good at it, it can be disgusting. Artis and Plague have insane add-ons. Oni has really powerful add-ons as well. What does Xenomorph have? Nothing. He has an add-on to vault things a little bit quicker, which is okay. That's a purple. And 2 add-ons to make his resistance to turrets a little bit greater. Normally, you want one or both of these add-ons. So basically, one add-on is already going to be a defensive add-on, and the other add-on might be the faster thingy. That's it. There are some other add-ons that have slightly milquetoast, average effect, but none of them are insane. If this killer had the add-ons of some other ones, they would be really strong, but they don't. A mangled add-on that doesn't even have hemorrhage, not so good. I honestly think this killer, the thing about it that's not super scary, right, is that it doesn't have any insane combination of add-ons and perks that make him unstoppable. In my opinion, he's kind of forced to run one add-on to make turrets less of an issue. You can take off this add-on, but then if you go against survivors that are half decent, then a single turret can be quite annoying as well, and hitting them with a basic attack becomes harder. So overall, I think they are a little bit limited in that regard. That being said, they are a really fun killer. They are super nasty and can hit over obstacles that you wouldn't even think of with their tail. And I personally really enjoy Xenomorph, but I think they're a bit limited for the reasons I described. Next up, Dredge. Oh my god, Dredge is so nice now. You might not think that he's climbed a lot in the tier list since last time, but I honestly think he has quite a bit. A lot of other killers have gotten stronger, and Dredge would have sunk down lower and lower if he'd remained the way he was. But luckily, he's gotten some changes. Number one, he no longer makes the noise that he used to make. The Dredge used to emit a permanent, super loud noise, whatever he was. So that meant that anytime you tried to do a little mind game somewhere, it was impossible. Survivors could basically tell where you were at any given time as long as you were close. That has been removed. He also has a 2-second faster cooldown outside of Nightfall, which is awesome. A faster teleport, which is awesome. And when you're setting up a remnant, that little shadow that you can teleport to, you're also faster, which is not super big, but pretty awesome. So he's a little bit better in almost every way, and that is great. Let me just say right now, Dredge is an absolute noob stomper. He is great at sowing chaos with his Nightfall and against new survivors. I can't imagine how oppressive that is. Against the higher levels, he is not such an incredible threat. He is quite vulnerable to survivors messing with your remnant and body blocks and whatnot. But keep in mind that if survivors give you hits early or often and they're injured, they're going to go into Nightfall very frequently. And once you go into Nightfall, you have insane mobility, insane detection, and also insane recovery on your power, so you can spam it really frequently. His ability to be in 2 places at once means that a lot of unsafe pallets become immediately unsafe. Some safe pallets become 50-50s, and you can force some pallets to be dropped and some windows to be abandoned much earlier than some other killers. I do think that still you are quite susceptible to exhaustion perks and to survivors going to the next loop, a little bit like the Artist. but he is a lot stronger than before. He also has some very mean add-ons. Unlike Xenomorph, you actually are quite spoiled for choice, and nothing feels mandatory anymore. You have an add-on that makes you come out of lockers faster, but you don't need it because they made it partially base kit. You have an add-on that makes you teleport quicker, but you don't need it because they made it partially base kit. You have the Automayon Riding, which makes your cooldown shorter, but you don't need it because they made it partially base kit. You see what I mean? They made a lot of add-ons partially base kit, and it feels really, really, really decent to play Dredge. At the end of the day, he's still an M1 killer that gets defeated by big combinations of like interconnected windows and strong tiles and whatnot. But yeah, you basically, as a Dredge, you will want to probe the team and poke the team in different places until you find someone that is going to give you free hits so that Nightfall happens sooner. Nightfall is when everything goes dark. And also a few downs so that you can begin to use your slowdown perks or perks that trigger upon hook, which are obviously the bread and butter of many killers. Next up, we have the Knight. The Knight, honestly, is also another killer that you might think is very low compared to before, but let me tell you, he's not in a bad spot compared to before. He has had a lot of quality of life updates and has had his power changed a little bit. You no longer have the ability to spam guards on top of survivors and do that. That is gone. But you are also much better at disrupting survivors from afar. Your guards that you send out further are much, much stronger, give you a speed boost and a bunch of other changes, right? Overall, he's far less add-on dependent than before. This was one of those killers that you had to play 100% with a certain add-on, or else he felt really, really bad. If anything, his new add-on that he really relies on is the yellow standard, just the yellow banner, just because sending guards out in the distance is the main way this killer gets into his gameplay loop. So from up close, this killer is a normal killer, normal terror radius, normal launch, normal movement speed, everything. Dropping a pallet in front of him can be really bad because he can immediately eviscerate the pallet with the Carnifex. Most survivors that are good are aware of this, so they're not going to drop pallets, and they might do a little 50-50. So this can be, something that catches, newer players, but it's not going to work against the best survivors. And then your other two guards are a little bit better of an option to harass people from afar. If you send the assassin, he is the fastest, and at medium range, he can sometimes get hits that other guards wouldn't. And if you send the jailer, he chases them for the furthest, and can actually get some nasty hits if you send it out to someone far away, because it starts to chase sooner. So basically, what the Knight has become now is a multitasking harasser. He has some add-ons as well to make this even easier. One particularly good one that is really accessible is the Green Torch. With the Green Torch, you send out a guard to a generator. Maybe you will know if a survivor's there through some perk of yours. And then while that survivor is unable to do anything, you are now undetectable and can catch someone else that was healing or on another generator. And all of these things build up. Survivors trying to take hits for each other can sometimes find themselves interrupted by guards, and once that happens, you can go right through them. And another thing that's pretty nasty for this killer as well is that he can prevent flashy saves, he can prevent pallet saves, and he can prevent decisive strike from being as effective. If you have a guard that you set up correctly and a survivor hits you with a stun or a rescue, that guard is likely to catch one of those survivors. Maybe not the one that was on the hook, but one of them, and get a hit. So altruism against this killer becomes a little bit more difficult. Just keep in mind that the ability to double tap survivors is now very much diminished. If you send out a guard to a survivor and then you chase on the same walking area as the guard disappears really quickly. So basically, you almost always want to pincer attack. The survivor is being chased towards the right, you come from the left, and you meet them in the middle. You force them. You want to be slightly far away from your own guards if possible, and force the character to the survivor to be hit by you or your guards. Now, one thing to keep in mind, one of the quote-unquote bugs has been made into a feature. If a survivor is being chased by a guard, they can run to a window, touch the window, and the guard pats strangely. They can also pick up the banner to become speedy and gain endurance. So your own power sometimes works against you. And I'm sorry, even though I find the Knight really fun sometimes. I still really don't like some of the bugs. This killer has been out for 2 years, and there are some bugs that still happen. I swear, got stunned during using my power, and there are some nasty little things. Needless to say, this killer is good at defending areas and doing hex builds. He has a variety of viable options, so you do have a bit of choice in there. Not too bad. Keep in mind, all of the killers in the C tier are actually not too far from B tier, but they need to be played much better. I think that if you're a Huntress and you're playing a bit sloppy, you're gonna do fine. If you're playing Nemesis and you don't play perfectly accurate, you're gonna do fine. You're playing, Hag and you don't place the perfect jab, you're probably gonna get away with it. But almost every killer in the C tier, even though some of them can be just as good as the ones in B, they need to be played very, very, very accurately. And some of these, honestly, are so difficult to play accurately that you might need to really dedicate a lot of hours to be good with them. Wraith is one of those killers that you wouldn't think needs to be super accurate, but honestly, playing him perfectly is quite difficult. Wraith is much higher than almost any other killer that doesn't have any insane chase potential. He, I think, is the perfect expression of an M1 killer that has to hit you with their basic attack. They don't have any incredible flight or pallet ignoring properties, right? But he has a lot of other small things going for him. He is much more resistant to bad maps than other M1 basic attack killers because of his insane mobility and ability to gather information by just going there himself. The fact that he is sneaky, that he can go around and breakable walls a little bit ahead of time and do all of these things, make him really suitable to defend 3-gen areas, to play very, very tactically, to not necessarily give up parts of the map early. With a lot of the other killers that we'll talk about, or that we've already talked about, you will look at gens in the distance and go, yeah, they gotta do that one. I can't defend that one. Not with Wraith. With Wraith, you can generally contest almost every single generator in the map, because after every hit or after every hook, you don't take that long to show up in a completely different part of the map. If you have information perks or information add-ons, there's a couple, or a lot of intuition, you can generally surprise survivors in a lot of different areas. People that play Wraith on a higher level, they also specialize on using specific add-ons to deal with pallets quicker and maybe vol windows faster and whatnot. These are the Shadow Dance and maybe Uncloak add-on. And you can do this to shut down common loops pretty damn quickly and make survivors a little bit stupid. Keep in mind that the good Wraiths will also leverage their ability to body block survivors using their speed as well. Overall, I think Wraith actually is a surprisingly effective killer if you use everything at your disposal. The fact that he can contest everything across the map makes him very, very good. A very good user of Ruin and other hexes. He also is decent at using other forms of slowdown, and anti-healing or healing interrupting hit and run style can also work sometimes, but you need to be you need to get a little bit lucky based on what the team is doing. So yeah, overall, he's a very versatile killer that can work well under a variety of maps. Needless to say, if you go to indoor maps and survivors don't have the ability to see more or less where you're going from a distance, he becomes quite sneaky, and a lot of his builds work out just fine, even if you don't have a special build for an indoor map. So yeah, he only gets stronger in those. Overall, you need to play him very, very tactically and be very good both in the 1v4 and the 1v1. If you are not super accurate with him and you don't know what you're doing and you're cloaking uncloaking randomly and getting stunned during cloak, which makes you stun longer, this killer would definitely be on the lowest tier. He would definitely feel below average then. Next up, we have the Doctor. The Doctor is another killer that has all of the hallmarks of a M1, aka basic attack killer. He moves at 115. He doesn't have any extreme mobility or teleport or anything like that. He has to hit survivors with his weapon. And that's most of his weaknesses right there. Survivors in big maps can spread out and diminish the effectiveness of his passive abilities. And in a pinch, they can also get together and body block for each other. And he doesn't have any insane ability to go through survivors like some other killers, or damage multiple at once like other killers. So he does have some of the basic weaknesses of the average killer, which limit his potential a little bit. That being said, he also has a lot of strengths. Perhaps the most notable one is the fact that he can get hits even when the map still has a lot of resources. For many of the other killers, especially the weaker ones, until you've already broken a few pallets, survivors are very safe. They go to main, they drop main, they go to shack, they drop shack, they go to a jungle gym, they drop the jungle gym, and you have to get rid of this, and your first minute or two can be a little bit rough. You might make up for it later, but your first minute will be rough, and that is very critical. With Doctor, you have the unique ability to shock survivors and deny their ability to drop pallets, windows, or anything like that, which means that you can sometimes get a down within a minute of the game, even when a lot of really good pallets are still standing. So that's wonderful. That is a really, really good thing that can get you started using perks like Pain Rest, Pop, Deadman Switch. Any perk that blocks generators or that benefits from survivors being disrupted is good on Doctor, because he has the ability to make survivors scream and interrupt them. For example, making them have to start over a totem again. So hexes can work on him as well. This also allows you to find survivors that are vulnerable or that are hiding, so that you have the best possible choice of who to chase. That is a wonderful thing as well on Doctor. You almost always are chasing a survivor on your terms, unlike other killers where sometimes you see a guy and you kind of have to commit because you don't have any tools to find anyone else. So that's great as well. If a survivor is carrying an item, you can also shock them or blast them enough until they are in Madness Tier 3. In Madness Tier 3, survivors cannot use items such as medkits in chase or flashlights, which can occasionally be quite helpful. And keep in mind that Madness also applies the effects of a lot of different add-ons. He's got a big collection of add-ons that do all kinds of effects, including things like having a fake terror radius or creating fake, illusory pallets. For below average and beginner survivors that are still not super familiar with the game, these effects are super overwhelming. For the higher level survivors that are super used to everything, they don't get full very often. Against those survivors, you're much better off running at least one discipline add-on. This add-on was made partially base kit, which is really, really good, but it still feels quite necessary. They are the family of add-ons that makes your shock hit the survivor sooner, which makes the actual chase power of Doctor a little bit better. He also benefits quite a bit from some perks that are not super popular in other killers, like Rapid Brutality, and especially from the perk from Sadako, Merciless Storm. This is a perk that can block generators for 20 seconds and make them lose 10% if you miss a skill check. With most of the killers, unless a survivor is quite a beginner, the skill checks are not very difficult. For the Doctor, skill checks in general are very, very nasty because they can come in reverse and they can appear anywhere on the screen depending on the madness level. So yeah, though he can use some perks really, really nastily, and as a result you have a killer that if you play him well and the survivors are not playing their they're looping perfectly, you will probably get downs and get the whole thing started. Next up we have the Trickster. The Trickster is one of those killers whose potential spikes very, very dramatically if you manage to main him or dedicate a lot of time to getting really, really good and accurate with him. He has some very accessible add-ons that make his damage per second very, very significant. It's one of those killers that body blocking against is a horrible idea. Being in the open against is a horrible idea. Yes, he has to reload, which wastes a little bit of his time, but in almost every single chase, you're going to be triggering the main event, which gives you a lot of damage per second and doesn't cost any ammo. So anything like basement or defensive options, if survivors misplay it, they are super, super, super dead. Not quite as instantly as Huntress, not quite as punishing as Huntress, but pretty damn close sometimes. Keep in mind, however, that survivors now have a little bit of time on their side when it comes to hook stages. They will often have the ability to stay on gens for longer, since hook stages are now 70 seconds longer, or 70 seconds in total instead of 60. And they also have some perks like Reassurance and the new perk Shoulder the Burden to play around hook stages. So you do not want to be too defensive with this killer at this point, or that could backfire. You need to be a bit more aggressive. And that, I think, is where this killer maybe suffers a little bit. In some maps, you don't find people super early. You have Lullaby that is even bigger than your terror radius. You might not find people right away. You don't have any built-in incredible abilities to find or detect vulnerable survivors or survivors that are out of place, such as the Doctor. Doctor has that ability. So yeah, your early game could be a little bit rough on some maps. And the fact that on some places you can get downs in seconds and on some other places you don't get a single knife in is a bit of a feast or famine. In some places, Trickster is just incredible, and survivors will avoid those places like the plague if they know what they're doing. And in some other bits, you might even need to drop chase in some areas, just because, you know, if you're chasing around a long wall just to get a couple knives in, it's hardly worth the effort. So yeah, Trickster hasn't moved a lot, but keep in mind he is going to get reworked at some point in the future. They're going to reverse some of the changes, so we'll see if that makes him stronger or weaker. This is quite a controversial placement, I imagine, because Trickster honestly has one of the lowest kill rates in the game. He really is difficult for a lot of people, but also if you see Trickster main players, you see just how absolutely insane they are and how much they dominate even against really decent survivors. So it's a killer that often gets underestimated for this reason. Another killer that largely goes underestimated is the Cannibal, aka Bubba. This is a killer that has received some quality of life changes. He is now a little bit less add-on dependent than before. If you go back a few months, almost everyone was running Chili on this killer, but now his add-on selection can be a bit more wide. Most people that like him still run one of the Beast Mark type add-ons to increase the movement of his soul once he's already started. That allows him to be a bit more aggressive in loops and do more fun things. With the higher speed, you can also do some mind games around certain tiles. And it's honestly, seeing a good Bubba is incredible. Needless to say, the ability to insta down multiple survivors at once also guarantees that if survivors group up in basement or anything like that, they will get absolutely cooked alive. And that is something that they often try to avoid. Unfortunately for you, it's not super difficult to avoid this. There are a lot of perks that allow survivors to be very self-sufficient, to split up and heal by themselves and maybe unhook themselves and do gens by themselves. And once they spread up to the edges of a large map, that can be your problem. In larger maps, the lack of any insane mobility on the Cannibal makes him a little bit difficult to keep up with survivors, especially if they find one or two places where one window can give them quite a lot of time before you get them down. Many times Cannibal players will run the perk Bamboozle to deal with windows and hope that they're not too interconnected. So he has a bit of the same problem as Billy, where if he wants to get the most out of his power, you will need to run a perk. Now, it's true that a lot of other killers also run perks to complement their powers, but very few killers need a perk. They benefit from it, but they don't need it. Cannibal sometimes feels like he needs that perk, and I think that weighs upon him a little bit. Now, that being said, like any other killer in the C tier, I think many of these killers have insanely high potential if your skill ceiling is high enough. So if you main this killer, you will still be able to keep up with some of the other stronger killers on any given day. So don't be discouraged. Next up, we have the good guy, aka Chucky. What an incredible fall this killer has had. If you asked me about this killer about a week ago, before the latest changes, he would have been somewhere between Singularity and the Spirit. Very close to the Spirit in strength. There's been comparisons, and honestly, both killers were pretty on par with how much damage they could do. They were both killers with short cooldowns and very quick bursts of chase speed that made survivors honestly quite helpless. But all of this has changed. Whereas Chucky could go under a pallet and then have full control of movement, he cannot do that anymore. Whereas Chucky had an incredibly short cooldown of less than 10 seconds, now it's quite longer. Whereas Chucky could do flicks with his slice and dice and hit you around corners like Oni, that has also been taken care of some time ago. And the most important thing that happened recently is that his movement speed, which was really fast, is now very slow. Survivors can react to it, and say that you get stunned on a pallet, which now is going to happen more and more. You have to break the pallet, catch up to the survivor. You can't really spam your power from ability as often as before, and you're 110. Yeah, Chucky does have all of the advantages of the third person, which can sometimes get you free hits, but the fact that you do spend quite a bit of time catching up to survivors as a 110 killer now feels really bad. Exhaustion perks now really matter. Before, if a survivor used life, balance landing, whatever the hell that gave them distance in front of you, you would quite literally catch up to them no matter what. Now, they often beat you to safety with that, and that feels pretty bad. He does have a bit of stealth, but keep in mind that his stealth warns survivors that it's active. And it doesn't last that long for the most part. So yeah, one of his best add-ons as well, the Rat Poison, which used to be arguably a little bit overpowered, was also nerfed. So even before this most recent nerf, yeah, that was also taken care of. I honestly think that after all of this, you have a killer that is sometimes okay at downing survivors in some places, but cannot deal with the big loops as much as before, does not have the map presence that he did before, is nowhere near as good. Like before, Chucky, if they were body blocking, you could literally outspeed them and hit them and squeeze past them. Now you're so slow that you honestly are going to eat almost everything. And it's almost like a slightly better pig. You could describe his ability, which is not a huge compliment. This is how I feel about Chucky, but we'll see if time puts him in his right place. We'll see if he gets some counter buffs after some time. Maybe I am overestimating the length of the buff. Please let me know in the comments what you think. Next up, we have Sadako, aka the Onryo. This is a killer that if you play her in a basic way, should belong in the lowest tier. She doesn't have any insane chase potential other than coming out of a TB and moving a little bit fast. She doesn't really do anything crazy, right? It's true that when she's demanifested, she doesn't get stunned by pallets, but this is not something that gets you downs everywhere or anything. So yeah, overall, this is not a killer that at face value gets a lot done. I also think it's worth mentioning that her ability to use the manifestation mind games is a little bit diminished right now. When Sadako is cloaked, the manifested, and shortly after she uncloaks, she goes invisible for a little bit, but some of these invisibility periods are bugged. So even when you use the Sadako watch, which was partially made into base kit, the survivors see you more than you see yourself. I know this is a little bit hard to understand, but basically when you're playing a Sadako, you will see that your hands disappear sometimes. They disappear from screen, right? And this is meant to represent the moments when survivors cannot see you. However, there is a discrepancy. The moments where you don't see yourself are actually longer than when survivors, basically they coded the invisibility to be longer for you, but not for the survivors when they buffed her. So that's a little bit of a problem. Also, Sadako some months ago was incredibly oppressive. You could teleport anywhere and everyone got condemned, and she had some add-ons that told you exactly where to go. There was some there was a short period where Sadako was really weak when she came out, and then really strong, right? And now, as I said, at face value, she's a very low tier killer. However, despite these condemned mind games not being ideally correct, they still work pretty well. You can still make a lot of mind games with her partial invisibility, and sometimes even get free hits due to her stealth. And the most important thing about Sadako is that unlike most of the low tier killers, she has a alternative win condition. She can win a game without hooking a single person. In fact, the average team is so utterly unprepared for this that if you spam your teleports with a little bit of sense, with a little bit of mindfulness, if you interrupt survivors and have a little bit of awareness about where they are delivering their tapes and their condemn builds up, you put a lot of pressure into survivors. Uncoordinated teams get immediately demolished by this. The more coordinated teams definitely handle it better and they do more high level stuff, right? But still, I think it's something that helps her climb out of the lowest tier. I think arguably if you are a Sadako main and you are incredibly good at micromanaging everyone's locations, you could pay attention to the HUD to see when a survivor has been hit by the condemn, which is a passive thing that builds up. You can also look at them, and based on the particles that they have on their character, you can tell how close they are. And eventually, if someone hits the maximum amount of condemn, you can get to them, down them, and instantly kill them, no matter the amount of hooks. There's also a few add-ons that facilitate and obfuscate a little bit the survivor's job. Another thing about Sadako that is pretty nice that many other quote-unquote low-tier killers don't have is the ability to ignore body blocks. If a survivor is being protected by a big conga line of other survivors, if you demanifest, you can go right through them. It can be a bit awkward sometimes, but definitely very difficult to body block. If survivors could body block for their teammate who is dead, if they get caught, that would be incredibly good for them, but they can't so easily against this killer. So all of this 1v4 and slight 1v1 potential plus the stealth makes her honestly a killer that is decent at almost any level, if for different reasons. Next up, we have Dermogorgon. This killer has been buffed recently. He's teleporting portals and some things around his portals have been changed to be a bit more streamlined, and that's okay. Nothing super crazy there. And on top of that, on top of the little mobility and little stealth that you get from portals, you also have a decently good chase power that can launch yourself from heights, that can break pallets relatively quickly or walls, and that can get hits on survivors in a lot of little straight lines. Overall, I think Dermogorgon is a super average killer. super average killer. Jack of all trades, but master of none. Some of his very strong add-ons that allowed him to have really, really crazy auto read on the entire team have been nerfed. Some of the add-ons that gave him really fast recovery have been nerfed slightly because they were a bit too popular. So you have a killer that is honestly really well polished around everywhere. There's not anything that he's incredibly weak at, right? But there's also nothing that he's incredibly insane at. You will have all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of your average killer, in my opinion. That is not a bad thing, and honestly, you have quite a bit of room to be creative. You can have a demo build that's more around defending things with your portals. You can have one with very minimal portal placement and just focus on the shred in chase. Good Demogorgons are pretty damn good to. Good when it comes to denying common tiles like Shack and whatnot. The problem with demo that you're going to find is that survivors love to send themselves to strong maps. Even if you use map offerings, every now and then you're going to go to maps where the main building is annoying, where they have pallets that, yeah, sure, they drop them, but you don't get a hit. And that is where Demogorgon is maybe closer to bottom tier than he is to high tier. Once you get a survivor that is willing to drop enough pallets, sure, you'll get rid of all the pallets, but you're not going to get them hits. And by the time your perks begin to really help you out, you will be at 1 or 2 gens left. That can be a little bit difficult. That being said, demo is not bad at all, and it's a great starting point for a lot of killer players. Next up, we get to Clown. Clown is another one of the killers in the C tier that has a deceivingly high skill ceiling. If using all of his bottles correctly, you will constantly be spinning yourself up, slowing survivor downs, applying all kinds of debuffs or little disadvantages to them, like being able to interrupt them with a direct hit and maybe giving yourself auto read with one of his purple add-ons. There's a lot of little things that go on here, and Clown has some beautiful synergies with basic attack perks. He can insta down, he can use coup de grace, he can use all kinds of like crafty little things, rapid brutality to make himself fast between hits. Like there's a lot of little things that go into Clown, and when you play Clown perfectly, man, survivors have to give up a lot of pallets per second, much faster than most of the killers around this level. Survivors have to choose between being hit and giving you resources really quickly. The best kept hidden secret of Clown mains is that many pallets don't even need to be broken. Unless it is a really, really strong pallet with a combination of purple and yellow, you almost always get a hit on almost any tile in the game that is not super, super big. So yeah, Clown can be incredible in that. However, Clown has to reload his bottles. He doesn't have unlimited momentum. In order to be really, really lethal in chase, he will often need 1 or 2 perks, which is not a big deal, but some of the killers are lethal with no perks. He doesn't have any insane ability to find survivors base kit, and his mobility, despite getting a little boost in chase, it's nothing extraordinary. In fact, it's below average. So what you're gonna find is that you can play Clown correctly and still sometimes lose to just sheer map size and survivor efficiency. If you go to a map that's big, survivors split up, and say they have a toolbox or 2, a deja vu or 2, and your gen delaying perks are not super lucky, you're gonna lose some games without necessarily doing anything wrong. Now, one thing that the Clown was particularly good at some time ago was to actually tunnel people. It's ugly, but the Clown is pretty good at very quickly hitting through survivors and slowing one survivor down so that he cannot body block another. So if you were a particularly nasty Clown player, you could sometimes get a survivor out of the way a little bit quicker. Problem: hook stages are now longer. Hook stages can be traded by survivors, so the ability to find yourself in a 3v1 is now harder to achieve sometimes. Survivors can delay people on the hook with reassurance. They can trade hook stages with the new perk Shoulder the Burden. So anything that delays the 3v1 and keeps 4 survivors on the board makes the game harder for any killer, but especially for Clown and all of the killers that will come after him. We're now deep into the bottom of the tier list. We're at the D tier. All of the killers here have one thing in common, And it is the fact that compared to the previous killers, especially the previous killer tier list, the previous tier, they have a considerable dip in skill ceiling. You can be a very good Clown main, you can be a very good Ghostface main, you can be a very good Myers main, but these killers do not give the same return on your investment as other killers. A good Dracula main is unstoppable. A good Doctor main is scary. A good Myers main is barely any better than a normal Myers, because Myers, Legion, Freddy, Skull Merchant to some degree, like these are killers that even if you are really good at them and you practice them a lot, they still depend a lot on randomness and their environment. And another thing that you're going to have in common with all of these killers is that they are very susceptible to their environment, to the map, the RNG, and the resources. If we go one tier up, even just Trickster, for example, he can make some loops unbelievably unsafe. Most of the killers on the D tier, they have to break pallets. They have to deal with loops, even just filler loops that are not super, super big. And that is something that they all have in common. Now, that being said, there is still quite a gap between the first and the last killer. So let's begin with the first, who is the Pig. The Pig has a power that allows her to go stealthy. It doesn't make her very fast, so it's not a super good idea to use this unless you already know where you're going. So it's a limited kind of stealth, a little bit similar to Chucky, if you will. And she also has the ability to dash and get hits. In some places, this dash is really, really useful and has some crazy utility. In some places, it can force 50-50s. In many other places, the survivor can just run away, or is so slow that you definitely don't even want to use it every single time. So she has a chase power that is a little bit limited. That is not a big deal because she has one of the best built-in slowdown kits in the game. With her ability to put down traps, you now can slow down survivors very, very significantly. On average, they'll have to do 12 searches if they go through all of them, right? Can be more with add-ons, can be less if you don't put all your traps and so on. But yeah, you have the ability to hold survivors hostage in the end of the game sometimes and delay them quite a bit. Sometimes with some add-ons, you can also get them killed, but they have nerfed the add-ons that make people's heads explode often, so this should not happen as often. Now, the biggest problem with the Pig and any other killer after this is that none of this matters if your first down takes forever. If your first down takes forever, then everything else becomes a little bit difficult. But the Pig still remains a pretty accessible killer for people that are learning the game. And even at high levels, you're going to do fine with her. You're just going to be using your power in chase a little bit less than some of the other killers that we talked about today. Ghostface has received some nice buffs to its cooldown and stalking rate, so to speak. They've made two of his best add-ons, which were brown add-ons, into his base kit partially, which is awesome. This also adds up to some buffs that he got some time ago that made his cooldown add-ons base kit as well. So, like, good stuff. Overall, Ghostface has gotten some love. Unfortunately, he's still a killer that, compared to everything else, compared to all of the new releases, he's a pretty basic killer. Insta-downing survivors is obviously useful, but it's quite map dependent. It's punishing if you make mistakes. You want to have information perks, but you're also a basic killer, so you're gonna miss that somewhere. You're very vulnerable to all of the meta stuff that survivors will bring, will probably hurt you in some way. But yeah, don't feel bad about any of that because Ghostface is still pretty fun. You can play him in a very casual way, just use his stealth and sneak up and ambush people. You can play him in a more tactical way where you 99 the stalk on people, and then later when you find them in a more vulnerable spot, you pop it and instant on them. At no point do you want to mark a survivor and then go on a long chase with them. That's not how Ghostface thrives. He has a few add-ons here and there with some nasty effects, but for the most part, they are fairly restrained, not super, super scary. And I think most other killers use the meta perks better than Ghostface does. He just gets boiled down to a little bit of a basic M1 killer. Now, that being said, if you play against survivors that don't deal with stealth very well, especially beginners, or if you get a really good lucky indoor map where you cannot be spotted from a mile away, that can really work out in your favor. Those maps are rarer than outdoor maps, but still, if you get one of those, Ghostface definitely gets a little bit scarier. Next up is Myers. Myers has received a decent bump from before. He could have easily placed in the bottom 3 not too long ago. But as of recent, Myers has received a few changes. These changes don't address some of his problematic add-ons, like the Tombstone, but they make his stalking out of tier 1 much easier. You now don't stay in tier 1 very long. Even if you are in tier 1, you move at 110 in tier 1, which is a massive, massive upgrade to before. They have changed one add-on to increase his tier 3 into being usable. His stalking is now better from a distance, which makes him a lot more consistent. Because before, Myers was good in close distance encounters, right? And in indoor maps. That was pretty much what Myers excelled at, and nothing else. In big maps, you were not good at stalking from a distance, and they could see you from afar, so you didn't have your stealth as much, right? So that sucked. Nowadays, this is a bit more in reverse. It's a bit more, what's the word? It's a bit more leveled. In indoor maps, Myers still retains the small turret radius advantage, and that's still awesome. But in big maps, he actually can stalk you as you run away from him. So if you pop a tier 3 on someone, you can instantly down them. And if you don't, you can just hit them. And as they run away, you can stalk them to get ready for the next one. So he's now become a little bit more consistent, if you will, while still retaining some of the strengths that he originally had, like being able to maybe get a cheeky pull out of a generator at the start. The problem with Myers is that once the initial impact and the initial surprise wears off, if survivors decide to play it really, really safe and split up, keep in mind, they can, if you hook a survivor, you can now, let's say that you have a really quick hook, right? A survivor can now be on the hook for 70 seconds. So survivors that play the game very, very slow and are not in a rush to all run at you and throw themselves at your arm can actually make your tier 3 not super effective. You can no longer play defensively around hooks. Survivors at this point are smart enough not to group up and give you multiple downs back to back. You will often need at least one perk to help you a little bit in chase, unless you want to eat every single pallet and window in existence. Most Myers will dedicate one perk to that. That's okay. But at the same time, you know, even if you run some of the meaner builds that Myers has access to, like some of his mean add-ons, which definitely can elevate him a little bit, even nowadays, survivors are pretty aware of that. You will have survivors going into lockers just to avoid the possibility of getting tombstone. So yeah, even some of his biggest strengths now are at this point quite well known to survivors. The fact that he's a normal basic M1 killer is his main drawback, and there's not much else to say about that. Next up is the Legion. The Legion is possibly one of the simplest killers in the game. This is not a bad thing. It's an easy killer to understand, an easy killer to get into, and a fantastic choice for any beginner intermediates that wants to just practice killer in general. He has a little bit of everything. He can, or they can detect survivors. They have a bit of anti-heal. They also start basically every chase by injuring you really, really easily. After that, they become a basic killer, and getting the next down might need a little bit of finesse, a little bit of tactics, maybe some perks to help you seal the deal. So yeah, that's mostly where their strength comes from, the ability to keep survivors injured very consistently. A lot of average players, once they're injured, they panic and they don't play as well. Some of them might also make the mistake of healing even in unreasonable amounts. Sometimes healing against Legion can be a good idea, but if you keep healing and he keeps injuring you and your teammate is dying and you just keep healing in a corner, that definitely will work out in their favor. But once survivors get a little bit better, your strengths begin to dissipate a little bit. The main thing that Legion can do is hit a survivor and then chain this into another survivor hit. To some degree, even good survivors will sometimes be forced to give you a couple injuries, but really aware survivors, especially if they're coordinated, they will do their best to split the heck up. With some perks and add-ons allowing survivors to heal themselves passively and being able to stay on the hook by themselves so long, and even being able to unhook themselves sometimes, you now have possibly and perks like Resurgence, you now have survivors that are extremely self-reliant compared to some time ago, right? And this is bad for Legion. If they don't group up, you can only really pressure them one at a time, and this just diminishes the impact that your power can have. The Legion can even sometimes, if he manages to stab 4 people, get a free down, and let me tell you, this happens very, very rarely against survivors that are worth their salt. Now, one thing to consider, Legion starts by injuring everyone super free. He has some perks that make his playstyle very, very simple. He has good synergy, and as long as you're getting it down every now and then, he can keep the game pretty slowed down. And all these things are great. They're average. Keep in mind, Legion and any other D tier killer are perfectly okay, even at higher levels. But as I said for many of the other killers, you're very much at the mercy of how good the survivors are at using their resources and splitting up. And even with some of the nasty tools that Legion has to be able to insta break pallets, good survivors will be, the better a survivor is, generally, the more comfortable they are at staying injured. And it's not something that scales super, super well. As you get better as a killer, Legion is not going to be able to allow you to express that skill as well as some other killers that have very, very intricate powers that can, really, really keep up with your hours. A Legion with 5,000 hours is probably pretty scary, but nowhere near as scary and as oppressive as a Huntress main of 5,000 hours, right? So, yeah. Next up, we have the Trapper. I love the Trapper. He was one of my favorite killers. He was my main for many years. So seeing him this low is always a bit disappointing, but he's always been down here. The Trapper, much like the other killers that we talked about, is a basic killer. He's a basic attack killer that has to hit you with their power, right? He cannot outplay most loops until he's already set up a trap there or doesn't mid-chase. And let me just tell you this. If you play against Trapper, follow basically 3 rules, right? Number 1, stay away from basement. Oh, I don't know where basement is. Find out and stay away from it. Number 2, if you take a hit, especially early on, run to wherever you spawn. Do not run into the place that the Trapper might have spawned in. So try to, anytime you take a hit, it's okay to take a hit, by the way. You don't need to stay healthy and try to use every loop because they could be trapped. So just take a hit and run back to safety. Force him out of his perimeter. And number 3, if you're out of chase, avoid going into grass. Take a little bit extra to not hug things. If you do these 3 things, let me tell you, I would lose every single game of Trapper ever. Every single game of Trapper ever, I pretty much win because someone goes in basement, someone steps on a trap when I'm not even there, or the survivor takes the chase into the wrong direction, ends up stepping on a trap, losing their ankles, losing the team's chances to win in the process. If you do those 3 basic things, Trapper is so unbelievably sad. Despite some of the buffs that he's gotten over the recent years, Trapper remains a very passive killer in a meta that rewards active, playstyle. Yes, you can now trap basement and make basement really, really nasty, as the same as he's been able to before. But we now have more perks and more things than ever before for survivors to honestly just do gens in the meantime. Deadlock is weaker, hook stages take longer, time is generally not on your side. Let's not even talk about the fact that if a survivor has a map, like the item, the map, they can find your traps with it, which is pathetic. And yeah, a lot of little weaknesses that come from Trapper. Honestly, he's not a bad killer. Even the ability to shut down any loop on command can be okay. Some of his add-ons can be pretty mean and catch survivors off guard. But yeah, he's just very, very limited by the fact that survivors following these rules that I outlined earlier will typically not give him a great start. Now that Myers has been buffed, I think Trapper is easily considered the killer with one of the worst starts at the beginning, right? And unlike Oni, once he really gets going, it might still involve a bit of luck and it's not guaranteed to get you downs. Next up, we have Freddy, a killer that is likely to be reworked and be quite different in the next month. So keep in mind, Freddy could be very high, very low, same spot, who knows, in a few weeks, right? Freddy right now is a killer that has 2 modes, depending on add-ons. Either he places fake pallets, which I think are weaker, or the default fake, like blood snares that slow down survivors, which I think are a bit stronger. He also has the ability to teleport. This is nice, by the way. The ability to teleport makes some big maps feel a bit smaller. Sometimes if Freddy is getting downs and triggering the effects of perks like Deadman's Rage, Pop, Painters, this and that, even a big map can sometimes not feel too big. But the problem is that getting those downs is hard. Whenever survivors are awake by finding a clock or at the start of the game or by waking each other up, the slowdown snares and the fake pallets don't work. So this is a killer that has a power sometimes. Now, let's do a little exercise and compare this killer to Dracula. Dracula has a power always. If he just used one of his powers, you can switch to another. Meanwhile, Freddy is incredibly limited. Now, way back in the day, if you watch some ancient tier lists, Freddy used to be insane because he had some crazy slowdown when you were asleep, or he could ignore borrowed time to down survivors right after being unhooked, and his snares, had bigger effects on this and that. All of this is gone. His add-ons are some of the worst add-ons in the game. He has received a few changes, and a couple of them have become more usable. But you still probably want to run the Iridescent add-on that makes everyone start out asleep and makes skill checks not wake survivors up. This feels like such a necessity on him sometimes for you to even have something to do during your first chase. He is really a killer that can be boiled down to very, very, very basic gameplay and comes down as very predictable. If you somehow prevent him by using your resources, from getting downs, he doesn't have a lot. He cannot force anything too much. Most of his strength comes down from the perk comes from the fact that after each down, he can teleport quickly to a gen and apply a bunch of perks. But if he doesn't get that down, it gets really, really difficult. Then we have the Skull Merchant. This is another killer that has had a meteoric fall from great heights. The Skull Merchant on release was a very annoying killer, capable of holding the game hostage pretty much by kicking gens repeatedly and making the progress almost impossible. They reworked her, then they reworked her again. And then we had a killer that was not necessarily problematic in the sense that she was too good at holding the game hostage. In fact, they even added a new mechanic to prevent gens from being kicked too many times, but she was a little bit all over the place. The Skull Merchant, up until very recently, her power inflicted Deep Wound, Hinder, Killer Instinct, being marked on the radar, a bunch of other status effects based on add-ons. Not to mention that it injured you, a lot of different things. She also became undetectable. Like, it was a killer that was like a stealth, area control, hybrid, that also gained speed. And the speed was variable based on how many people were detected. So you could be on a loop and have no idea, depending on add-ons, on how your teammates have been detected. You had no idea whether or not she would catch you. And all of this frustrated people a lot. People did not enjoy playing against her. The developers have a plan to change this killer into something else entirely, like a little bit of a rework. But until this happened, they just decided, well, let's just nuke her. So what they did is they basically turbo nerfed this killer. Much harsher nerf than Chucky. Her drone scans, which had two scan lines, now only have one. So instead of being like a clock with two handles, it's a clock with a single handle. So her ability to detect survivors is halved. The speed that she gets from detecting a survivor is conditional, only happens if the drone was replaced or placed recently. Injuring survivors is a lot harder. If they have a brain, it will almost never happen outside of chase, and rarely inside of chase even. And there's a lot of counterplay, like standing still or crouching, if you want to avoid like a last second, sudden drone scan. Not to mention the fact that she's still bugged and sometimes her drones don't move or have other erratic behavior. Her drones can also be disabled by a survivor. So basically you have a killer that's supposed to be like stealth, area control, area denial, and occasional information gathering. Nowadays, all of these things are a little bit weaker. I think what she excels at is being a stealth killer. Being able to place a drone and having a few 8-ish seconds of stealth can still be okay. And sometimes survivors see a drone and they outplay themselves, and that can be okay. However, once you play against survivors that know what they're doing and they know they don't need to be afraid of your drones and actually use the maps, and the map, say, is a little bit big, so your stealth doesn't matter too much, or it's quite open and your stealth doesn't matter so much, you have one of the most mediocre, useless, painful experiences in the game. Generally on a league of its own on how dull it is. You can use your power a lot and do a lot of crazy, I'm going to change the direction of the drone to try to slow them down, and end up getting absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, with some of the other killers that we discussed today, you press one button and the survivor's dead by comparison. So yeah, she's a bit of a sad killer at the moment, but this is by design. The developers intentionally made her very weak so that no one would play her, and judging by the statistics, which say that she's one of the least popular killers ever, it seems like they did the right thing, or at least they got the intended outcome. No one will probably play this killer until she gets reworked sometime in the next year. And you know what else will happen sometime in the next year? I will release the next tier list. Until then, I hope this one has been useful,